This is Audible.
This is Baby, Let's Play House, written by Alana Nash, read for you by Aaron Spencer, with the introduction read by the author.
No matter if he were young and thin, a vision in gold lame, or middle-aged and paunchy, stretching the physical limits of his gabardine jumpsuit, Elvis Presley never failed to affect his female audiences the same way. He drove them crazy. The mere sight and sound of him made women around the world drop all inhibitions and to publicly behave as they never would otherwise, giving in to screams, fainting, and wild exhibitions of frenzy. Sometime during the 1970s, when Elvis was a Las Vegas staple, Jean Bon, who had started his entertainment career in the 1960s as one-third of the Les Bernettes, Montreal's answer to the Beatles, was flabbergasted to see the reaction of one woman who attended Elvis's dinner show at the Las Vegas Hilton. In between songs, some 25 minutes into the performance, as Elvis shook hands and kissed the women who crowded up near the stage and hoped to receive one of the multitude of scarves he ceremoniously dispensed, we heard a woman yelling in the back of the room, and then we turned to see her hopping from one tabletop to the other to get up to Elvis. He was so surprised. He made a face like, "Wow, what happened?" Everybody in the room was laughing. Then she put her arms around his neck and kissed him. He smiled and gave her a scarf, and then she turned around and did the same thing, jumping from one table to the other. Everybody started to applaud. Yet Elvis was never more potent than at the beginning of his career, before the patently routine scarf offering, when he was dangerous, revolutionary, and nobody knew what to expect. On November 23, 1956, 2 days after the nationwide release of Love Me Tender, Elvis's first film, a high school photographer named Lou Allen covered a Presley concert in Cleveland and was astonished at what he saw. There was a row of policemen standing in front of the stage, and girls would start at the back of the auditorium with their eyes on Elvis and run as fast as they could toward the stage. They'd bounce off these policemen's stomachs and then bounce back 4 or 5 feet and land on their rear ends, and they would still have their eyes on Elvis. It was amazing. They did it repeatedly, like flies running into a light bulb. Allen may have been dumbfounded, but as blues songwriter Willie Dixon teased, "The men don't know, but the little girls understand." 1956 was a great year, remembers Presley's seminal guitarist, Scotty Moore. The crowds had gotten very large, and it would get so loud that it would just cancel out all the sound on stage. The best way I can describe it is like when you dive into the water and you hear the phasing, the rush of the water. Actually, on most songs, if we couldn't hear him, we'd know where he was at by his body language. We were the only band I know literally directed by an ass. As Elvis worked out his own private fantasies on stage, an entire nation would take his directive, even if it was initially slow to accept it. Elvis's sexual history, the rock critic Robert Christgau has written, inflects the myth of a feral young Southerner whose twitching hips were the point of articulation for a seismic shift in American mores. The exact moment of that shift, according to some Elvisologists, arrived on June 5, 1956, when the 21-year-old Presley appeared on The Milton Berle Show. It was not Presley's television debut. But in his previous network appearances, when his guitar had largely restricted his movements, Elvis relied more on attitude, sinking eyelids, a curled lip, sideburns, and a husky voice that rose from somewhere below the waist, as newsman Peter Jennings later put it, to convey his libidinous intent. Now on the Burl Show, performing a lascivious rendition of Hound Dog, he moved in a way that was completely unfathomable for a white boy of the 1950s, punctuating a drawn-out, halftime ending with the burlesque bumps and grinds of a female stripper. At one point in the flurry of sexual shakes and shimmies, he seemed to hump the microphone. And in a futuristic salute to his would-be son-in-law, Michael Jackson, almost grab his crotch. The following day, newspapers across the nation bellowed their outrage at this obscene purveyor of the fledgling art form called rock and roll. Ben Gross of the New York Daily News decrying that popular music had reached its lowest depth in the grunt and groin antics of one Elvis Presley. 40 years later, in his book, Elvis After Elvis, The Posthumous Career of a Living Legend, Gilbert B. Rodman, an assistant professor of communications at the University of South Florida, would label Elvis's performance on The Burl Show a message so shocking that it seemed that Western civilization could not possibly survive its utterance, and call it the moment when rock and roll was recognized as a threat to mainstream U.S. culture. Such intellectual hand-wringing brings to mind the old black and white film clips of grim-faced men warning of the dangers of rock and roll, urging decent, God-fearing Americans to smash any copies of the devil music they could find, lest the nation's youth be corrupted and damned to hell. Yet despite on which side of the moral fence one sits, there is no arguing that if Frank Sinatra was the first popular singer to make women swoon with the thoughts of romantic love, Elvis moved those obsessions lower, to erotic regions no mainstream performer had dared acknowledge with such fierce abandon. Today, Elvis's movements seem tame to younger generations raised on incendiary films and videos. But few rock and rollers of any era have moved with such salacious insouciance, writes Chris Gow. In 1956, the cantilevered poetry of Elvis's swiveling midsection, coupled with the eye-popping sight of his left leg working like a jackhammer, quickly led journalist Pinckney Keel of the Jackson, Mississippi Clarion Ledger to dub him Elvis the Pelvis, a term Elvis despised, calling it one of the most childish expressions I've ever heard coming from an adult. That same year, on August 6, 1956, Tampa journalist Paul Wilder, a crony of Elvis's nefarious manager, Colonel Tom Parker, conducted one of the few and most famous interviews with Elvis for TV Guide. Backstage, before the show in Lakeland, Florida, Wilder got Elvis's dander up when he read him a review from the Miami Herald that criticized both his voice and his guitar playing. What remains, unfortunately, the article concluded, are his pelvic gyrations, and that's the core of the whole appeal, sex stimulations. Any answer to that one? Wilder asked. Well, I don't roll my, pelvic gyrations, an indignant Elvis replied. My pelvis had nothing to do with what I do. I just kind of get in rhythm with the music. I jump around to it because I enjoy what I'm doing. not trying to be vulgar, not trying to sell any sex, not trying to look vulgar and nasty. I just enjoy what I'm doing and trying to make the best of it. It was a fib, of course. Even then, he knew the power he had on stage and off, the way he could charm the pants off a snake in novelist Bobby Ann Mason's Southern Expression. She touched my hand, what a chill I got. Her lips are like a volcano that's hot. I'm proud to say she's my buttercup. I'm in love. I'm all shook up. Oh, yeah, yeah. For a man who was literally pawed, groped, scratched, and had his clothes ripped away by women for his entire 21-year career, Presley demonstrated a remarkable tolerance for his audience. He rarely seemed to resent their overexuberant physical presence, their endless requests for autographs, or worse, the way their desire to possess him kept him a virtual prison in hotel rooms and at home in his beloved Graceland. In that regard, he stands almost alone in the pantheon of great rock stars, many of whom despise the very people who made them. He enjoyed the feel of being with fans, remembers photographer Alfred Wertheimer, who gained unprecedented access to Presley in 1956 and captured some of the best-known images of young Elvis. He loved being with girls. Later on, I found out whether the girls were 8 years old or 18 or 65 or 70. He just liked women. Hank Saperstein, the merchandiser who plastered Elvis's likeness on everything from panties to record players to lipstick in Tutti Frutti Red and Hound Dog Orange in 1956, noticed that both women and men responded equally to Elvis's sneer. His sneer was all important. It was a good-looking, lovable sneer. But if both sexes inherently embrace the cruelty and playfulness in that curl of the lip, why did only women faint at Presley's concerts? The word fan comes from fanatic, of course, but a more interesting focus is the origin of hysteria, a Greek medical term, hysterikos. It means dysfunctional or wandering uterus. Hippocrates coined the word, believing that madness overcame women who adhered to sexual abstinence, and that the uterus wandered upward, compressing the diaphragm, heart, and lungs. There's poetry in the fact, then, that Elvis learned certain of his stage moves from women, one of the surprises of this book. And it suggests that part of his potency was not just his ability to translate precisely what turned women on, but to mimic their actions back to them. However, so much of what made Elvis Elvis sprang from his assimilation of Black culture, both in his native Tupelo, Mississippi, and in his adopted hometown of Memphis. This was true both of his music, a greasy, intense union of white and black in its mix of country and blues, and gospel and pop, and in the fur-trimmed flamboyance of his personal style. His sexual savagery on stage challenged the traditional view of white masculinity, particularly as he arrived on the national consciousness in the staid, button-gloved Eisenhower era, dominated by the bland orchestras of Mantovani, Hugo Winterhalter, and Percy Faith. Everything about him, from his exotic looks, hooded eyes giving way to an impossibly pomaded ducktail, to his sound, the haunting spookiness of Heartbreak Hotel, suggested an alien inexplicably fallen to earth. People wonder why everyone impersonates the old Elvis, says Kevin Eggers, the founder of Tomato Records, who met Presley at a touch football game in Beverly Hills, California, as a teenager. But if a young person could do the same Elvis, they'd be a superstar. That raw talent, that incredible creature, came on stage and changed everything, including, to some degree, the perception of male beauty and the acceptance of androgyny, since Elvis crossed the sex barrier just as he had the race barrier. From the first, he wore eyeshadow and mascara to accentuate his likeness to his mother Gladys, and to emulate Rudolph Valentino, the silent screen star once accused of the effeminization of the American male. And by his early Las Vegas incarnation, Elvis personified the glam rock movement that was then burgeoning in the United Kingdom, blending the sex appeal of men and women in his choice of flowing stage wear. Perhaps not surprising, Elvis's contemporary appeal does not stop with heterosexual women. Female Elvis impersonator Lee Crow, a.k.a. Elvis Herselvis, who identifies as a drag king, predicts that Elvis will become a lesbian icon just as Marilyn Monroe is for gay men. Like Katie Lang, she says, the whole image that she's got, that's where it came from. And Lang bears it out. He was the total androgynous beauty. I would practice Elvis in front of the mirror when I was 12 or 13 years old. For so many reasons, then, Elvis swims in our minds and in the emotions all through time, offers film director David Lynch. There's the word icon, and I don't think anybody has topped that. Not one single person has ever topped Elvis. Except in 2006, the one year Kurt Cobain bested him on the Forbes top-earning dead celebrities list. Only to have Elvis take back his crown in 2007, the 30th year anniversary of his death, hauling in $52 million. But in 2009, he slipped to fourth place with $55 million, dwarfed by Yves Saint Laurent, $350 million, Rodgers and Hammerstein, $235 million, and Michael Jackson, $90 million. Still, $55 million is more than many of the music industry's most popular living acts command. For a dead man, writes author Rodman, Elvis Presley is awfully noisy. In the spring of 2007, I received a call from Nancy Beaulieu, an editor at Ladies' Home Journal, who wanted an Elvis story for the August issue to mark the anniversary. But exactly what kind of article she didn't know. Since it was a women's magazine, I suggested what I thought was the obvious, an oral history of some of the women in Elvis's life, both platonic and romantic, from girlfriends to family members, to actresses to backup singers. I wanted to know how his status as one of the greatest sex symbols of the 20th century informed his stage act and his interactions with the opposite sex. The resulting article, The Women Who Loved Elvis, was one of the best-read features in the magazine and spawned a segment on The Early Show on CBS. Not long after, I was in Memphis writing a story about Graceland for another publication. Staying in the Heartbreak Hotel across the street from the mansion's sprawl, I stared at the photos on the wall of my suite. In each of them, Elvis held the luminous gaze of one of his Hollywood co-stars. I thought of the millions of women who had loved him from afar, the hundreds who had physically known that embrace, and how he had died alone at home, on the bathroom floor, a woman sleeping in his bed as the life ebbed out of him at the age of 42. How could Elvis Presley, one of the most romantic icons of his time, never have enjoyed a long-lasting, meaningful relationship with a woman? That was the question I pondered as the idea for this book took shape. It was particularly puzzling since, for all his maleness, Elvis was a very woman-centered man. It was women he could really talk with, and from whom he drew much of his strength. The answer, of course, is that it was simply easier for a man as complex as Elvis to have a relationship with the masses, who asked nothing of him and provided unconditional, positive regard. Bottom line, says Kay Wheeler, who headed Presley's first national fan club, the most successful love affair was obviously between Elvis and his fans, and it has not died. Elvis's sexual history, that great Pandora's box on which Christgau and Rodman lifted the lid, held fascinating surprises.
1. My best gal. Gladys. In rock and roll mythology, she is the proud, all-suffering Madonna, the commoner who birthed a king and died too soon, knocking his world off its axis. Like her famous son, her first name is all that's needed. Elvis called her my best gal. But in the deepest psychological sense, she was not only his best gal, but also his only one. In the well-known images from the late 1950s, she appears a defeated figure, her eyes sad and ringed by bruised circles, her mouth perpetually turned down and set in a sorrowful scowl. At the height of her son's notoriety, when she was ensconced in Graceland, the home and farm Elvis bought for her, surrounded by the kind of luxury she had never really wanted and rarely enjoyed, she spent her days as she always had, dipping snuff, drinking beer from a paper sack, staring out the window, and for a short time until Elvis's record company complained it wasn't seemly, feeding her chickens out back. The hot-tempered woman who had been known to dump a pot of steaming beans on her husband's head when he crossed her was now a fearful soul, afraid for Elvis's safety. She is always worried about a wreck or me getting sick. The way the women mauled him at his shows, and worse, how his stratospheric career had changed everything so fast, wrenchingly pulling him away from her and from everything they had always known. As if to reverse it all and find some comfort, she made monthly visits to the area surrounding the small town of Tupelo, Mississippi, where she had grown up. Earlier in her life, she had been an outgoing girl, a happy, joking person with a lifelong love of dancing. The Gladys of old had a light in her eyes, a future in her smile, and could make you laugh when nobody else could, remembered Annie Presley, the wife of Sales Presley, a first cousin to Elvis's father, Vernon. That Gladys vanished once Elvis became famous. But one thing remained a constant. Gladys had always been so entwined with her son that it was hard to know where she left off, and he began, even for the two of them. It came both from circumstances beyond their control and from a need that was so great and pervasive as to be encoded in their DNA. She was born April 25th, 1912, in rural Pontotoc County, Mississippi, the daughter of Robert Lee Smith and Octavia Luvenia Mansell Smith. Gladys's mother was known by the name of Lucy and the nickname of Doll for her slim frame, porcelain skin, oval face, and small features. Not uncommon in farming families, the Smith children numbered 8, Gladys's arrival falling after the first 3 girls, Lillian, Laval, and Retha. And before Travis, Tracy, Cletus, and John. A ninth child did not survive. Her parents romantically gave Gladys the middle name of Love. At 2, Tracy, who was already mentally impaired, contracted whooping cough and lost his hearing. But the real invalid of the family was Doll, Gladys's mother, who had been diagnosed with tuberculosis as a child. Doll, everyone knew, was a relentless flirt, and having been babied by her parents for her affliction and her birth order, she was the youngest of 7, expected the same from everyone around her. When she finally chose to marry at age 27, she picked a younger mate, her first cousin Bob, a handsome man with dark, deep-set eyes that attested to his mix of Scots-Irish and Indian ancestry through the marriage of William Mansell and Mourning Dove White, a full-blooded Cherokee. Gladys's roots would prove even more fascinating. White Mansell, the son of John Mansell and grandson of William Mansell, were an Alabaman who moved to northeast Mississippi at 18 to homestead. There, in 1870, marking an X for his signature, he married Martha Tackett, whose mother, Nancy J. Burdine Tackett, was Jewish. Among their children was Doll, Gladys's mother. Since by Jewish orthodoxy the mother continues the heritage, Gladys was technically Jewish. Like many Southern broods, the Smith family was strongly matriarchal. Doll's illness rarely allowed her to leave her bed, but she ruled the family with her sickness. Her feelings of entitlement allowed her to keep a comb and mirror hidden beneath her pillow, while her children slept together on the floor on a mattress padded with crabgrass, held their flimsy shoes together with metal rings culled from the snouts of slaughtered hogs, and fashioned toothbrushes from the branch of a black gum tree. When the Smiths moved, as they often did, dotting the communities around Tupelo and Lee County, she would be carefully carried on a trailer in a supine position, like a priceless artifact in a traveling exhibit, as Elvis biographer and psychologist Peter O. Whitmer wrote in The Inner Elvis. Her husband, Bob, desperate to scratch out a living from a land where poverty was the norm, demonstrated no love of farming, especially tenant farming, by which he fed his family. He also relied on handouts. Mereties Finley Collins remembered her mother, Verity, would say to the Smith children, "Bring a bucket," and then she'd put the leftovers in it for the Smith children to eat. Years later, once Elvis became famous, the press labeled the whole Presley clan white trash. The Smiths still bristle at the term, even though rumor had it that Bob provided the extras Doll wanted from a less respectable trade. Just because you're poor doesn't mean you're white trash, even if you're a sharecropper, insists Billy Smith, Gladys's nephew through her brother Travis, a hard drinker with a violent streak for fighting. I guess you couldn't be the son of a bootlegger and not drink, because that's what my granddaddy Robert was, a bootlegger, even though he farmed too. It wasn't just Bob who catered to Doll, but her children too. Though Lillian, somewhat Gladys's rival, reported her sister to always be lazy as a hog. Shirking her housework, she could rise to the occasion. By her teenage years, Gladys was industrious, making her own clothes on her friend Vera Turner's sewing machine when she wasn't taking care of her mother or the crops. The harsh reality of life in Tupelo. The year Gladys was born, the town had only one short expanse of sidewalk and no paved streets, let alone electricity, made death, religion, and sheer survival in unstable times the central themes of existence. The late Janelle McComb, a lifelong Tupelo resident, remembered the kinds of tenets that helped most folks cope. Old Dr. William Robert Hunt, who delivered Elvis, was my Sunday school teacher, and he was one of my granddaddy's best friends. When I was a little girl, he told me one day that I was going to heaven and that I would walk upon streets of gold and have a mansion. I walked a dirt path, so I couldn't imagine that. My granddaddy ran a grocery store, so I walked in there and I said, "Granddaddy, Dr. Hunt says that when I die, I'm going to heaven and I'll have a mansion." Then I looked up and said, "But Granddaddy, how am I going to get there?" He closed the store and he walked outside with me. There was a chinaberry tree in the yard, and he put my hand on it and he said, "My child, the timber you send up is what your mansion will be made of. Don't ever send up bad timber." That stayed with me all the days of my life. Still, what got most people through day to day was the rural code of solidarity. This tiny, impoverished community somehow survived by mutually sharing good fortune. The late Elaine Dundee, author of Elvis and Gladys, said in 2004. The one existing home-owned Kodak became the communal camera, as did the few radios on the streets. If a few folks chafed at the idea, they hid it well and maintained their standing by practicing the art of good manners with an almost ritualized politeness and having an attitude of optimism in spite of everything. Dave Irwin, his son Len, and his wife Lily Mae ran a general store in East Tupelo and remembered that though the Smiths might be poor, they still found money to buy things, especially after Bob got a loan from the bank and moved the family to an untenanted farm of 30 acres and a house with hedge roses growing around the front door. To Len, it seemed like the promised land to him. Gladys, particularly, held her head high. She looked nice, showed off her new homemade dresses, kept her clothes clean, and seemed to come into the store 60 times a day, often in the company of her younger sister, Cletus. First, it might be a box of snuff to keep hunger at bay. Then, next trip, maybe a rope of licorice or a knee-high soda, and on subsequent visits a bottle of Grove's Chill Tonic for Doll, and then perhaps some peppermint sticks. By all accounts, Gladys was a lively, passionate young woman who hoped to make a good impression and be accepted by others. She loved to buck dance for the neighbors on Saturday night and dreamed of being either a singer like Mississippi's own radio star Jimmy Rogers or an actress like Clara Bow, whose new talking pictures Gladys watched on a makeshift movie screen on the back of a flatbed truck. But for all her gaiety, her ire could flare like a firestorm, and no one wanted her wrath. Gladys had inherited not only her father's deep-set eyes, but also his irritability. "Everybody in that family was scared of Gladys and her temper," says Lamar Fike, a member of Elvis's entourage, the Memphis Mafia, who came to know Gladys well. "She ran all those kids, even her eldest sister Lillian. Everybody knew not to mess with her much. With a couple of exceptions, the Smith family was just wilder than goats. By God, they were tough. Tougher even than the Presleys, and they were violent people." Coupled with her muscular build, her big, wide shoulders making her resemble a man at times, Gladys's temper made her a force to be reckoned with. Even as a child working on Burke's farm, where sharecroppers, getting a little for themselves and making a whole lot more for someone else, as Billy Smith puts it, were regarded as little more than animals. Aunt Gladys was a strong-willed individual. If you scared her real bad or made her mad, she'd lash out at you. In Tupelo, they still talk about when she was sharecropping with her family. The guy who owned the farm come by on a horse with his high-topped leather boots and a whip, and he jumped on her father and her sisters with it. Gladys was 10 or 11 years old, but she ripped a plowshare off and took the point and hit him in the head with it. Damn near killed him. Still, Gladys had her vulnerabilities, most of them emotional. Though she attended religious services, worshiping at the Church of God and Prophecy, Gladys held to primitive superstitions, and not even her faith could completely quell the anxiety and impulsivity that plagued her from the time she was a small child. In Lillian's view, the young Gladys was very highly strung, very nervous. She was frightened by all kinds of things, by thunderstorms and wind. She was always hearing noises outside at night and imagining there was someone in the bushes. In time, her uneasiness with life would escalate to full-blown phobias. Once she moved to East Tupelo, which sat across Town Creek from the more prosperous Tupelo proper, she had all the bushes around her house cut down, terrified that dark things were moving in them. Her anxieties came and went without warning. She seemed better with the promise of social outlets, when she had something to look forward to, something that would take her mind off the dreariness of existing hand to mouth. And one of the things that most stirred her imagination was the opposite sex. As a young child, Gladys seemed scared of boys. Her sister Lillian recalled that the first time a boy asked if he could walk her home from school, Gladys took off her shoes and ran. When he caught up with her, he walked way on one side of the road and she way on the other. Such an extreme reaction may have been in response to her parents' teachings, as her father forged a rigid code of courtship, ruling that the boys who came calling on his daughters go no further than holding hands. Kissing was strictly forbidden, as it inevitably led to other things. By her late teens, Gladys was well over her fear of boys, and now it was she who chased them. Years later, Pitt Harris, who dated her in her youth, reported she was fast and liked to play, which of course was a scandal. He remembered her fighting with another girl, the two of them slapping and hitting. We had to pull them off of each other, evidently over a man. But one by one, her older sisters were leaving home to marry, and now Gladys felt the pressure. Her impulsiveness, coupled with her desire to escape the oppression of toiling the fields and caring for her mother and younger siblings, led her to elope with a young farmer when she was in her late teens. Her embarrassment knew no bounds when she learned the man was married. In 2 days' time, she was back, morbidly ashamed and heartbroken. Gladys's emotional state grew more fragile in 1931, with the tragic and sudden death of her father from pneumonia. The family was stunned with disbelief. Doll had always been the sickly one, and so unprepared they had to borrow a winding sheet from Mrs. Irwin, the co-proprietor of the general store, to wrap the body for placement in an unmarked grave in Spring Hill Cemetery. But rather than stepping up and taking charge, 19-year-old Gladys seemed to crumble. Coming so soon after her failed elopement, the loss of her father was a double blow. Bob Smith had been the one stable man in her life. His death immeasurably increased Gladys's responsibilities with her mother, 3 younger brothers, and 12-year-old sister. But try as they might, they could not bring in the crop, and the family's sudden reversal of fortune meant that they would lose the new house and farm. Worse, the family would be split up, with Doll going to live with Laval and her husband, Ed. Gladys, feeling responsible for the rest of the family, would have to find a full-time job in a town that offered little employment outside of the cotton mill and textile plant. In the weeks that followed, Gladys fell into a complete and total collapse. At first, she seemed to revert to the lethargy that had so annoyed Lillian when Gladys was an adolescent. But then she began displaying the classic symptoms of what psychologists call conversion hysteria, in which grief becomes manifested in physical ailments. A friend remembered she became so anxious that she could not walk. Gladys got herself into such a state that her legs would start shaking every time she was fixing to go out of the house. Finally, she took to the safety of her bed, unable to move without the help of others, replicating the state that her mother had manifested for decades. Conversion hysteria acts to block the mental pain from conscious awareness, and also provides the benefit of allowing its victims to avoid unwanted responsibilities, wrote psychologist Whitmer. In short, Gladys, overburdened with grief and unable to deal with reality, infantilized herself. 10 years later, in the winter of 1941, she had a similar reaction to another tragedy. This time, conversion hysteria rendered her mute. Annie Presley, Gladys's cousin and neighbor, heard a knock and opened the door to find Gladys in such a high state of anxiety that she could not move. She just stood there, saying nothing. Tears were streaming down her cheeks. She was wringing her hands over and over. It was only from a neighbor that Annie learned that Gladys's older sister, Retha Smith Lloyd, had died a terrible death. Back in them days, we had wood stoves, and she went to build a fire in the stove to cook dinner, and thought she had got all of the sparks out from the one before. She poured a little coal oil in it, and it flamed up and caught her on fire and burned her. Retha lingered a few agonizing hours before expiring. In both instances, the only thing that freed Gladys from psychological paralysis and restored her to normalcy was her religious faith, particularly after she began participating in Pentecostal services at the tiny Assembly of God Church in the economically deprived East Tupelo, sharply divided from Tupelo by a levee and cotton fields. There, in a tent pitched on a neighborhood lot, some 30 worshippers gathered each Sunday to pray, sing, and feel the Spirit take hold way down inside them. Later, they moved to an old building up on the highway. Annie Presley termed it a tabernacle. Just a roof and a couple of sides, didn't even have a front, no pews or chairs, just things set up with long planks across them. They called them benches. The congregation also met in an old movie house, ironic, since the Assembly of God frowned on picture shows, if not music. In all of our church services, music and singing were very meaningful parts, recalled Reverend Frank W. Smith, who became pastor at the church about 10 years later. We would always begin our services with congregational singing. Not loud singing, but worship singing. We had a song leader, and everyone would join in and sing along together. Sometimes there would be no worshipful expressions during this part of the service, just singing. As in other Pentecostal churches, the Assembly of God revered speaking in tongues as evidence that the Holy Spirit talked through the parishioners. Both the speakers and the interpreters of the sounds, variously called the barks, the jerks, and the holy laugh, were held in the highest esteem. 4 months after the horrific trauma of Retha's death, Gladys attended yet another tragedy and demonstrated previously unseen emotional strength. Annie's third baby, Barbara Sue, delivered at home, died 8 hours after birth from asphyxiation from too much mucus in her lungs. Gladys was in and out all day, but she had been there from about 5 o'clock on that evening, because the baby was strangling pretty bad, and we called Dr. Robert Pegram about 3 times, and he wouldn't come. By the time he got there, she was dead. Gladys was the one that took the baby out of my bed and put it over on another bed when she died. She stayed right with me. Annie, only 19, was too weak and distraught to go to the graveyard, so Gladys stayed with her then, too, while everybody else went. "Your belief in God will get you through," Gladys told the devastated mother over and over. "Look to God." Gladys's faith in a higher power brought her more than spiritual salve, however, for it was in that East Tupelo church in the spring of 1933 that Gladys Love Smith, who had just turned 21 and operated a sewing machine at the Tupelo Garment Company for $2 a day, first laid eyes on Vernon Elvis Presley. He was blondish, fine-featured, well-mannered around women, and with full lips that curled into an easy sneer. He looked like a backwoods Romeo straight out of Tobacco Road, Erskine Caldwell's classic novel of sex and violence among the rural poor. They eloped 2 months after they met, on June 17, 1933, in Pontotoc County, where Vernon, barely 17 but looking every bit a full-grown man, could pass as one. He borrowed the money for the marriage license, which spelled his name Virnon, either because the clerk made an error or because Vernon, who was only semi-literate throughout his life, knew no better. Both he and his bride lied about their ages, Vernon adding 5 years for 22, and Gladys subtracting 2 for 19. In a photograph taken of them about that time, they can hardly conceal their hunger for each other, their heads pressed together, Gladys snuggled up to him from behind, her arm around his shoulder. Yet it was not precisely love at first sight. Initially, Gladys dated Vernon's older brother, Vester, while her younger sister, Cletus, went with Vernon. Gladys didn't like my attitude much, Vester said years later. I was too wild in those days, so Gladys quit seeing me and we quit seeing the Smith girls for a while. But soon it was a foursome again, as Cletus married Vester after Gladys wed Vernon. 2 brothers marrying 2 sisters. To further entangle the family tree, rooted in the first cousin union of Bob and Doll Smith, Travis and John Smith, Gladys's brothers, also married sisters. So their kids and my brother Bobby and me were double first cousins, explains Billy Smith. You've got double first cousins on the Presley side, too. Gladys's family was large, sprawling, and financially unstable. But in some ways, the Smiths were high-minded and genteel compared to the Presleys, another matriarchal Southern clan. None of that was lost on the locals. As Tupelo historian Roy Turner recounts, when Meretese Finley Collins told her mother she had bumped into Gladys Smith in town and learned she had married Vernon Presley, her mother replied, "One of the Presleys above the highway," which was to distinguish where in the East Tupelo hierarchy they were. Even as Tupelo looked down on East Tupelo was divided into 2 sects, the more prosperous below the highway, and the less fortunate above the highway being 78. Vernon's grandmother, Rosella Presley, was the daughter of Dunnan Presley, Jr., a Confederate Army deserter and bigamist who abandoned the family when Rosella was a baby to return to his first wife and child. Rosella, who never knew him, grew up independent and free-thinking and continued the tradition, bringing 10 illegitimate children into the world by various men who never stayed long enough to know their offspring. A sharecropper, she died at 63 without ever identifying the fathers of most of her children. But her youngest son, Joseph Presley, would say a man named Steele, part Cherokee Indian, sired at least a few of her brood. She was a very strict disciplinarian, but a loving mother. Despite the hardships, she always managed to give each of us a little present at Christmas, even if it was only a piece of candy or a second-hand pair of shoes. Though she had no real education, she wanted better for her children, and saw to it that they attended school. 2 of them exemplified the best and worst of the family, and set themselves up as passionate rivals in the tradition of John Steinbeck's East of Eden. Noah Presley, the good son, moved to East Tupelo, where he ran a grocery store and drove a school bus. Civic-minded, with a soft spot for children, he had 13 of his own, he regularly took the kids of East Tupelo to the zoo in Memphis on Sundays. In 1936, when he ran for mayor of East Tupelo, then little more than a wide spot in the road, and considered inferior to the larger town of 6,000 citizens, he was handily elected, gaining praise for improving East Tupelo's physical facilities. On the other end of the scale was Jesse Presley, also known as J.D. His mother had bestowed a gift upon him that she'd withheld from the rest of her children, honoring him with his real father's surname, McLowell, in addition to her own. A sharecropper on Orville Bean's dairy farm, Jesse had 5 children: Vernon, Vester, Gladys Erlene, Nasville Laureen, also known as Nashville or Nash, and Delta May, with wife Minnie Mae Hood, a tall, skinny, peppery woman from Fulton, Mississippi, whom he tried to dominate. Like his son, Jesse had married at 17, wedding an older woman, Minnie Mae was 8 years his senior, of higher social standing. In contrast to his brother, Jessie D. McLeod Presley was as self-centered and parsimonious as Noah was generous. Everyone in East Tupelo talked about how mean he was, particularly when he drank. They clucked about his habit of locking up his whiskey so Minnie May couldn't get to it, and laughed at his stinginess in dictating how many pieces of cheese she could slice or biscuits she could serve when guests came calling. Remembered one relative. When that was gone, you was out, so we didn't ever go back no more for dinner. We went somewhere else if we wanted to eat. Still, Jesse has his defenders. Was he being stingy, or were the times just hard and he was being careful? Asks Tony Stutchbury, an Elvis aficionado from England who often visits Tupelo to gather information for his website. To judge him on that is a little bit unfair. I don't think he's the bad apple that people have painted him to be. Yet Jesse's relationship with Vernon was also often strained, and when the boy was 15, his father sent him away for a year to share crop on the farm of a relative, likely as a disciplinary action. But Jesse also may have been jealous of Vernon's physique and good looks, and considered him a sexual threat. For Jesse took pride in his own appearance and was known around the county as a womanizing dandy. When he'd get off of work on Friday, Annie Presley remembered, you'd see him go home and take a bath and dress to a T, and then you wouldn't see him till Sunday evening late. Given to dapper suits, he cut such a handsome figure that women were said to stare at him as he strutted down the road. Jesse may have also seen something else of himself in Vernon, as Vernon was the bad son to Vester's good, just as Jesse had been compared with Noah. But Vernon did, in fact, demonstrate an aversion to three things: responsibility, conflict, and work. For a while, he and Vester, shorter, scrawnier, and no competition with the ladies, tried farming a little truck patch together, planting cotton, corn, and soybeans. But Vernon hated getting up before the sun and soon resorted to odd jobs, including working for Orville Bean. Gladys's paycheck kept them going, and Minnie May, who called Vernon her favorite, saw how they struggled to get by. They needed a house of their own, Minnie told her husband, and they could build it right next to theirs on East Tupelo's old Saltillo Road, on Bean's property, located above Highway 78, which shuttled travelers between Tupelo and Birmingham, Alabama. Vernon borrowed $180 from Bean to buy lumber for a little 2-room, wood-frame shotgun house, with the understanding that he would pay him rent to retire the loan with interest. Jesse, who was a skilled carpenter, helped his son with the construction, as did Vester. The three, mindful of the floods that raged through the area in the spring, raised the little house off the ground with stone piles. When it was finished, in 1934, it resembled housing constructed for mill villages around the area and was solid enough to last 100 years or so, if not especially fancy, with no indoor plumbing or ceiling, just the roof. The two families shared a cow and some chickens out back. The image of the Presleys' first house would be seared in Elvis's mind forever. In the 5th grade, he would write a poem in a classmate's autograph book. Roses are red, violets are blue. When a chicken gets in your house, you should say, shoo, shoo, shoo. When you get married and live in a shack, make your children clothes out of toe sacks. By the end of June 1934, Gladys realized she was pregnant, and around her 5th month, she told everybody she was having identical twins. Not only was she uncommonly large, all swollen up and heavy, and her legs hurting her, but also with time she could feel 2 babies kicking inside her. Besides, twins ran in the family on both sides. Gladys had identical twin cousins, Elsie and Ellis Mansell, and Sales Presley had a fraternal twin, Gordon. Annie and Sales's daughter would also have twins, and Travis and Lorraine Smith would sadly lose a set of twins. For her baby shower, Gladys received the usual items that comfort newborn infants: but also 2 sheets and $30 in cash. Her friends and family were concerned that Vernon would drink it all up. Gladys had always wanted a house full of children, all of them around her all the time, and she and Vernon were giddy with the news. Vernon thought he was a stud, remembers Lamar Fike. Elvis used to say that Vernon knew when Elvis was conceived, because afterwards he blacked out. They picked out rhyming names: Jesse Guerin for the firstborn and Elvis Aaron. Jesse was to honor Vernon's father, and Elvis came from Vernon's middle name. They chose Aaron for Aaron Kennedy, Vernon's best friend. The Guerin simply rhymed with Aaron. In the pre-dawn morning of January 8, 1935, Gladys awoke to intense labor pains and rallied her husband from sleep. "Vernon," she said, shaking him, "I think it's time. You'd best get your mama over here and go call the doctor." Vernon lit the oil lamp, took one look at his wife's face beaded with sweat, and then raced across the yard to his parents' house and pounded on the door. "Mama, Papa, come quick. Gladys is in labor." Minnie May and Jessie rushed over in their night clothes, Jessie still hungover from the night before. Minnie May asked Gladys some questions, and then also implored her son to get the doctor. He took off running to Highway 78 and the nearest telephone, dialing the 4 numbers that connected him to 68-year-old Dr. William Robert Hunt, the poor man's physician, who had been practicing in Tupelo since 1913, the year he received his Tulane University medical degree. Minnie May somehow sent word to the midwife, Edna Robinson, and began boiling a large pot of water on the wood-burning stove. By the time Dr. Hunt arrived, steering his Model T Ford the 1.5 miles across the levee to the Presley home, Gladys was about to deliver. Jesse Guerin appeared first, around 4 a.m. Then a hush fell over the room, and Dr. Hunt announced that the child was lifeless, stillborn. Gladys let out a long, piercing wail as the midwife carried the dead infant out into the back room. Vernon, too, was crying, but according to the story Billy Smith heard down the years from the family, Jesse, drunk out of his mind, thought Vernon was laughing. He went in and said, "Gitchy gitchy goo," and, "Oh, ain't it a beautiful baby?" The baby didn't respond, of course, so Jesse just kept going, "Gitchy gitchy goo." Vernon was hurt to the bone, so finally he yelled out, "Oh, goddamn, Daddy, the baby is dead." Jesse got this funny look on his face and just said, "Oh. About the time all that was happening, about 4:35 a.m., Elvis was born. Precisely what happened to Jesse Guerin is open to speculation. Vester wrote in his book, A Presley Speaks, that Gladys and Vernon had been in a car accident just months before the twins were born, and that, in fact, they'd paid the rent on their little 2-room house with their settlement money. Might Jesse have been injured in the accident? And then there's front porch gossip. According to the oft-repeated story, Dr. Hunt had his coat on to leave when Gladys insisted there was another baby. But a doctor who was about to record his 919th and 920th births would have recognized the signs of a second child, particularly the fact that Gladys's uterus was still swollen. One variation of the tale has it that the first baby could have lived, that Dr. Hunt was, indeed, surprised by the second birth and had spent too much time attending to Elvis when something as routine as clearing Jesse's windpipe might have saved him. Vernon, in a story he told for the rest of his life, saw the tragedy as God's will. Just before the births, he said, there were 2 identical medicine bottles setting on the mantel of the fireplace. Just as Gladys was giving birth, one of the bottles inexplicably burst, while the other remained intact. After Jesse was pronounced dead, Vernon interpreted the exploding bottle as a sign from heaven. When Jesse died, he said, Elvis took over his soul and spirit. No matter what the cause of the baby's death, Gladys, friends said, looked more than half dead from blood loss, and Dr. Hunt, who billed the Presleys only $15 as a labor case, sent her to the Tupelo hospital, where she would stay for 2 weeks. Elvis, who was being breastfed, went with her. The weekend after Elvis's birth, Dr. Hunt announced in church that the Presleys had had twins and that one had died. The community may have been poor, but it looked after its own, Janelle McComb reported. Some of the congregation went to visit and took things. A few days after the delivery, a still exhausted Dr. Hunt recorded the births in his ledger, misspelling Elvis as Evis, probably following Vernon's pronunciation, and transposing the I from Jesse into Garion. He similarly erred on baby Jesse's death certificate, recording the date of birth as January 7 and listing him only as the nameless infant of Vernon Presley, repeating the original family spelling. Dr. Hunt's daughter, Sarah Hunt Potter, would later say that she wasn't certain that 4:35 a.m., Elvis's time of birth as recorded in the ledger, was correct, since her father had waited so long to enter it. However, a bigger mystery than the exact time of Elvis's birth is the location of his dead twin's grave. For decades, it was said that on January 9, Vernon had climbed the hilly terrain of East Tupelo's tiny Priceville Cemetery in the bitter cold with a little coffin, a minister, and an undertaker from W.E. Pagees at his side. There, in the Presley plot, they supposedly carried out their grim task, burying the infant in an unmarked grave that all but disappeared when the grass grew in. But Priceville has been questioned in later years. Billy Smith says that Jesse was indeed buried in an unmarked grave, but in another cemetery closer to Saltillo. One of Elvis's classmates insists the twin was buried in a cemetery by St. Mark's Methodist Church, across from the birthplace. And Joe Savory, who owns the original death certificate, has said that nobody really knows where that child is buried. Later on, Elvis tried to find out. You would think that somebody in the family would have known where they buried that child, but I have never known anybody that does. However, Roy Turner believes Priceville is the burial spot after all. Someone put a small marble foot marker there years ago that sets near the grave of Noah Presley. When I stumbled on what I thought was Jesse's grave, because of the chronology of the surrounding Presley graves, then a space for 2 more that was never used, I assumed this was the spot. A lot of people in that era were not able to afford tombstones. When I first saw the grave, there was only a concrete chunk marking the spot and some artificial flowers. Becky Martin, one of Elvis's favorite 5th-grade classmates, confirmed it as Jesse's final resting place, and remembered the Presley family usually put flowers on the grave when they visited the cemetery each Decoration Day, which at Priceville is the first Sunday in August. Jesse's death certificate also lists Priceville Cemetery as the burial site, as does the receipt at Pagees for the coffin. Some years back, I was doing a documentary on the 1936 Tupelo tornado and interviewed Mr. Pagees, wanting to know how many deaths they handled, continued Roy Turner. While he was going through his records, he said, "You might be interested in this." The book contained records from the 1930s, and the funeral director showed Turner where Vernon bought and paid for the coffin, and for Pagees to handle the burial. People say, why didn't they just move Jesse to Graceland the way they did Elvis and Gladys? Asks Billy Smith. There wasn't anything to move. They had a little wood coffin for the baby and all, but there couldn't be anything to move but a hunk of dirt. The little coffin's rotted and gone. Baby's gone. Maybe bones. We don't really know. Why bother? Leave it in its resting place. Today, the Presley grave sites in Graceland's meditation garden include a small plaque for Jesse, as J.D. Presley spelled it, not Jesse, as is so often written. From the moment Elvis was born, Mother and son demonstrated a remarkable closeness, almost as if Gladys had been Elvis's twin, and not Jessie. She tended to the infant's every need, refusing to hand off care to a relative or even her husband for a single afternoon's respite. Gladys had a one-track mind, offered a female cousin. She would hold that baby so tight I thought he might suffocate. She wouldn't let nobody carry him around but her, not even Vernon. In fact, Vernon, who had so held his young bride's affections, would in short order seem more like a boarder in the house, as he would for the remainder of the Presleys' life together. As Lamar Fike says, Gladys ruled her house when she married, but when Elvis came along, he and Gladys ruled that roost together. You had a wife who dominated the whole thing, a husband who didn't like to work, and an only child who was doted on by his mother. A child who listened to his mother and father argue all their lives. That's what molded Elvis into what he was. It was one of the most dysfunctional families I've ever seen. Any mother who lost one of her twin babies, as Gladys had, would have naturally feared losing the surviving child, as Gladys did as long as she lived. Leona Moore, a former nurse at the Tupelo Hospital, told author Elaine Dundee that Gladys miscarried another child when Elvis was 7. Billy Smith doubts it, saying he would have heard that in the family. But true or not, Gladys apparently was not capable of having other children, which further contributed to her overprotection of Elvis. "My mother," the adult Elvis would say, "I suppose since I was an only child that we might have been a little closer than... everyone loves their mother, but Mother was always right with me all my life." During Elvis's formative years, a number of events collided to cement her relentless hold on him, more for her comfort and solace than his. The first occurred 9 months after Elvis's birth, when Gladys's grandmother, Anne Mansell Smith, mother of Bob and the matriarch of the Smith family, died. Far worse, in a matter of weeks, Gladys's own mother, the tubercular doll, expired at 59. Her passing marked 3 deaths in the immediate family in 11 months, reawakening Gladys's fears, phobias, and abandonment issues. She clung to her son tighter than before, almost as if he were a shield against a treacherous and mercurial world, where disaster could strike at any second and take away all that mattered. Such a calamity came dangerously close on April 5, 1936, when the 4th deadliest tornado in United States history roared through Tupelo, taking 235 lives, injuring another 350 residents, and decimating 48 city blocks. "It sounded like a bunch of freight cars running together," Magnolia Clanton remembered. "It just hit, and you heard people screaming in the streets, and you didn't know which way you were going or which way you were going to go because you went crazy." As the storm first gathered, the winds tearing through the trees and the sky darkening to an ominous shade, Noah Presley ran for his school bus. He drove to Jessie and Minnie Mae's home, gathering his parents and then Vernon and Gladys next door, so they could all be together at his house, which was stronger and larger than anyone else's. Gladys held 1-year-old Elvis close up against her, climbed on the bus, and the family then hurried to the Baptist church where Vernon's sister, Little Gladys, as he called her to differentiate her from his wife, was in worship. Jessie rushed to the back of the church and issued the storm warning to the congregation, and then they were off to Noah's. There, the men braced themselves along the planks on the south wall for added strength, while the women prayed. In a comical scene, Minnie Mae fainted, then came to, and fainted again, over and over, while Gladys huddled in the corner, too frightened to speak, a death grip on her blonde-haired, blue-eyed baby. However, she, too, nearly lost consciousness when she returned home. The Methodist church directly across the street had been totally leveled, yet the storm had left the little homemade house untouched. Again, Gladys turned to her faith to sustain her, and to praise God for her family's being spared. The following year or so, she gave thanks for a new place to worship when her uncle, Gaines Mansell, became the preacher at the newly built Assembly of God Church, about a block from the Presleys' home. One day, Gladys testified to a vision she'd had, in which Elvis was going to amount to something special. More than that, he would be a great leader of men. She told her family the same thing, and believed it with all her heart. He was special, having the power of two people because of the dead twin. Elvis would be infused with all the positive attributes that Jesse might have had, as well as his own. That gave him twice the looks, twice the personality, twice the talent, twice the intelligence, and twice the spiritual connection. Precisely what kind of charismatic services the Presleys attended at the new Assembly of God Church is largely left up to the imagination, except for Annie Presley's description. The services would start about 7:30 at night. Sometimes you got home long after midnight. They'd have the altar call, and after that they'd pray for 2 or 3 hours and shout and sing. You'd be praying, and you'd just get so happy till you'd just jump up and go to shouting. Some of them would get to talking in tongues. There'd be shouting all over the building, "Praise the Lord, hallelujah, glory, I love you, Lord," anything like that. In the early 1980s, when Roy Turner assisted author Elaine Dundee in tracing Gladys's path in Tupelo, Corrine Smith, the wife of Reverend Frank W. Smith, who took over the church when Elvis was 10 or 11, suggested that if the researchers wanted to see religion the way Elvis experienced it, they would have to go to the county. The city churches had become too sophisticated. And so Turner and Dundee drove out to Pontotoc County. After about 3 hours of the service in hot Mississippi, humid July weather, in a little church with ceiling fans whirling and windows opened, we left, Turner recalls. The service continued until way into the night. The people had danced around the entire sanctuary, shouting, writhing, fainting, wailing to exhaustion. Elaine remarked, "I feel like I have been to an Elvis concert." Dundee was, in fact, witnessing the grassroots of the entire Elvis Presley phenomenon, from the music to the reaction of his fans. And it took hold early. Once Elvis became famous, Gladys would recall one particular Sunday in the Assembly of God Church, when 2-year-old Elvis, normally a quiet and reserved child, squirmed off her lap to make his way up on the platform to try to sing with the choir. Soon it got to be his habit. It was a small church, so you couldn't sing too loud, the grown-up Elvis said. Gladys used to laugh about it, Harold Lloyd, Retha's son, remembered. The preacher and all of them thought it was cute, so they got to where they would let him stand up there and sing with them. Psychologist Whitmer, an expert on twinless twins, or twins who have lost their mirror image, whether fraternal or identical, isn't surprised. While pregnant, Gladys spent hours every single day at the Assembly of God Church. If you look at in utero imaging, in the last trimester you see twins hugging, punching, kicking, and dancing to music. Sound is incredibly important. Elvis then instinctively began moving to music before he was born. He learned to communicate, to feel good, through instruments and voices. While he was still in the womb, music became a dynamic and primary way of expressing himself in his relationship with his twin, his mother, and all that defined his world. At the end of 1937, just before Elvis's 3rd birthday, another seminal event occurred in the Presley family, one that had tragic consequences for all involved. On November 16, 1937, Vernon, along with Gladys's brother, Travis Smith, and their friend Lether Gable, were criminally charged with uttering a forged instrument. The story goes that they had altered a $4 check from Vernon's usurious landlord and part-time employer, Orville Bean, in payment for a hog. Vernon was enraged. The hog was worth at least $50, and he'd been expecting the much larger sum. Besides, he needed the money, and so the three talked it over. Exactly what happened next has been muddied through the years. Aaron Kennedy always said that Vernon changed the amount to either $14 or $40, but the courthouse records do not include the details. However, in a newly discovered letter from 1938, Orville Bean said that Vernon allowed the two others to copy Bean's signature and forge checks on him, Vernon receiving $15 for his trouble and silence. They were drinking and just did it on a whim, says Billy Smith, Travis's son. Vernon got to thinking about it, and the more he thought about it, the madder he got. And they said, well, we'll fix him. And Daddy was always ready to do any and everything, and he was easily persuaded by people. From what my mama told me, they lived high for a time. Daddy and Lether went down to Texas to try to find a job. Mama said Daddy had this idea he was really going to be Mr. It, but all they came back with was a new shirt, a new pair of pants, and a big hat. And as soon as he stepped off the train, they were waiting for him and hauled him right on off. They'd already gotten Vernon by this time. He was in jail. Initially, none of the three men could post bail, set surprisingly high at $500 each. Then, on January 4th, 1938, two bonds were filed. The first for Lether and the second for Travis. As no record exists for Vernon's bail, he was apparently left to cool his heels for 6 months in custody awaiting trial. But the galling news was that Vernon's own father had gone in on the bail for Travis. Whether he feared angering his landlord, Bean, whose land he still sharecropped, isn't known. Annie Presley believed that Noah Presley eventually posted bond for Vernon, but J.D. first intended to let his son rot in the Lee County Jail, later having a change of heart. Maybe J.D. thought he was going to teach Vernon a lesson, muses Billy Smith. But to be honest, I think he just liked Daddy better than he did Vernon. Vernon was likable, but my daddy, you couldn't help but like him. He was a whole lot like Aunt Gladys. At the trial, emotions still ran high. Bean shouted out at one point, calling Vernon long hungry, local slang for a glutton who'd steal from the mouths of his own family to gorge himself. There was no greater insult, and Elvis would hear it the rest of his days. On May 25th, 1938, Vernon and Travis were sentenced to 3 years in the Mississippi State Penitentiary at Parchman, the legendarily cruel institution where prisoners were routinely bullwhipped and put on chain gangs as terrifying lessons in the evils of defying authority. Yet, surprisingly, Vernon got a reprieve of sorts. Shortly after he arrived on June 1st, the warden made him a trustee, which afforded him a room at the warden's house for conjugal visits, according to Annie Presley. While Gladys, with Elvis in tow, would make the 5-hour trip whenever she could. Noah Presley drove them every third Sunday. Vernon's time away would be a watershed event. By the time he returned, all three Presleys would suffer from sleepwalking, or action nightmares, as one cousin put it in Southern parlance. And Vernon would be but a stick figure in the lives of his wife and child. Elvis and Gladys would be so fatalistically close that anyone else amounted to an intruder. Elvis belonged to her and Gladys to him. They were one, and no one else would ever make the other feel whole again. 2. An ideal guy. Vernon would be released from Parchman with a 6-month suspension of his sentence on February 6, 1939, largely because he demonstrated good behavior and an appropriate degree of remorse for his crime. He had served 9 months. Gladys had done her part too, literally walking door to door in Lee County, gathering signatures on a petition to vouch for his character, and cajoling Orville Bean into writing a letter to Governor Hugh White pleading for leniency. The money was repaid to me, and this man realizes the mistake he has made, and I believe he has been sufficiently punished. He is a splendid young man." Gladys also wrote at least 2 missives, both on lined tablet paper, lobbying for a pardon or a 6-month parole. She insisted Vernon had never been in any trouble with the law. He has never even been drunk in his life, and that he had simply been persuaded into selling some boys a signature off of a check, and didn't understand the consequences. In the first letter, on October 29, 1938, she argued on behalf of herself and Minnie May. His mother is sitting here broken-hearted beside me. But in the second, dated November 25, 1938, she spoke powerfully about her own personal hardship. "My health is bad, and I have no mother or daddy and no one to look to for a living. I have a little boy 3 years old. Please send my husband home to his wife and baby." Until Vernon returned, however, Gladys went back to work in the fields. By each September, the cotton crop was in, and Gladys would hire out along with nearly everybody else in East Tupelo, her fingers bleeding as she picked the soft white bolls from the prickly burrs, her back bent into the stalks, 2 rows at a time. It was grueling work, especially when the sun beat down upon her. But it paid real money, $1.50 per 100 pounds of cotton, and she could take her baby with her, little Elvis, wearing overalls and a brimmed hat to shield him from the sun, riding on her 6-foot duck sack as she pulled it along the rows. He never forgot it, saying years later he had seen her put stockings on her arms or pour buttermilk on them to quell the sunburn when she went into the fields. But no matter how much cotton she picked, or sewing or laundry she took in, Gladys couldn't keep up the payment schedule to Orville Bean. "He wouldn't wait on you. If you didn't have the rent, he'd tell you to move right quick," remembered one resident. Before long, she and Elvis would have to leave. Aunt Gladys made the rounds, staying at different people's houses, Billy Smith recounts. At one point, she moved in with her first cousin, Frank Richards. Elvis, clutching his teddy bear, Mabel, would sit on the porch, crying his eyes out because his daddy was away, a relative recalled. Gladys, too, suffered mightily, a friend said. After Vernon went to prison, she was awful nervous. Before the move, at night, in the front room of the house her husband and father-in-law had built with their own hands, she and her son would share the little iron bed that the 3 of them had occupied when Vernon was there, Elvis tucked under her arm. Awaiting sleep, after a spare supper of beans, potatoes, and maybe a little side meat, they would lie there and listen to the battery radio as a light breeze blew through the curtains. Gladys would speak of Jesse, telling Elvis of the brother he never knew. From an early age, "He'd run up to you as soon as you'd come into the house," Annie Presley remembered. "He could tell you right quick, 'I had a brother.'" During the months that Vernon was incarcerated, Elvis and Gladys bonded in the unhealthy state that psychologist and Elvis biographer Whitmer terms lethal enmeshment, a normal developmental reality for the twinless twin. Several factors contributed to it, starting with the fact that Elvis and Gladys slept in the same bed. While such a practice was hardly unusual in impoverished households of the South, the end result was that Elvis could never differentiate from his mother, and that he remained a part of her. Such non-sexual or covert incest contributed to a sense of shame, sexual confusion, and conflict. Shame was something that the 3-year-old was already grappling with on 2 other fronts. While Vernon would never be a strong father figure, his absence, and Elvis's witnessing his father in the frightening prison garb at Parchman during family visits, would have left such a sensitive child with a sense of disgrace. Elvis's Tupelo playmates report that he never discussed his father's incarceration as he grew older. As a tiny child, only his mother's comfort could have alleviated his anxiety. However, the larger sense of shame and guilt would have come from the death of his brother, or more specifically, Elvis's having survived when his mirror image died. While he would have taken pride in the fact that he had triumphed, that he was the stronger one, the superior one, and been singled out, twinless twins blame themselves for their sibling's death, writes Whitmer in The Inner Elvis. To win Gladys's love, Elvis knew he must grieve for the dead twin. Jesse's death was yet another trauma that mother and son shared, and Elvis would have felt fear and pain that he had denied his mother her other child. As if to make it up to her and assuage his own feelings, Elvis reversed the role of parent and child, behavior typical of twinless twins whose mothers are smothering and overprotective. At the age of 3, with Vernon out of the house, he felt responsible for her happiness and became Gladys's caretaker, substitute spouse, and primary source of intimacy. Robbing himself of his childhood, he tried to fill her emptiness in every way. Visitors were often surprised that such a small boy was so solicitous of his mother, Elvis repeatedly asking her if she needed a glass of water or a chair, or otherwise seeing to her every creature comfort. In a bizarre scenario that clearly demonstrates how boundary violations occurred in the family, the toddler would become both parentified and sexualized. As Lillian Smith recalled, Elvis was just learning to walk and talk. He would walk very, very fast through the house, and every time he came to Gladys, he'd reach up and pat her on the head and call her baby. "There, there, my little baby," he would say. It was a term he would use for her all her life, and in fact, he referred to both his parents as his babies well into his early fame. In a sense, by including Vernon, he desexualized his father as his competition for Gladys's affections. All of these factors would have collided to influence Elvis's sexuality, with trauma that comes early and is both prolonged and extreme. Biochemical changes can occur in human development, particularly in sexual dimorphism, or the biochemical determinants of masculinity and femininity, the estrogen-androgen balance, which results in the physical differences between the sexes. Elvis would grow up to be a beautiful, not a rugged man, with softer, somewhat female characteristics, full lips, sleepy eyes, and very little body hair, especially chest hair, that in part accounted for his androgynous sex appeal. Socially, he would also behave in ways that didn't fit the contemporary norms of the times. He gave himself Tony home permanents, went to a beauty shop instead of a barber, and sometimes modeled eye makeup in his teens, even before he was regularly on stage. In the 1960s, he often wore pancake makeup when he wasn't making movies. Whether Gladys introduced him to makeup, "You're the prettiest thing on the face of the earth, put a little eye color on," Elvis wasn't homosexual. His testosterone levels, coupled with his grounding in the importance of the Southern male, never tempted him to act out sexually with another man. Furthermore, he was wonderfully capable of compartmentalizing all of his behavior and building walls. The adult Elvis saw no conflict in his desire to wear mascara, or dye his eyelashes, and carry a gun, the symbolic phallus, at the same time. While the toddler Elvis and Gladys symbiotically turned to each other to meet nearly all their emotional needs, Elvis had more to work out through the relationship. He took the fact that he had a twin toe, a bit of webbing or extra skin that connects the second and third digits into nearly one unit, as a sign that he had been an identical twin. His grief for his brother grew into a yearning for a sense of completeness with another human being. As Whitmer writes, given what is known about the lifelong importance of intrauterine bonding, the enmeshed relationship that gradually became obvious between mother and son had its origins before birth. Elvis simply and naturally transferred all his tactile and sensory needs from Jessie and invested them in his mother. His sense of being joined with Jessie was replaced by being one with Gladys. In other words, Elvis shifted all of his feelings for his twin onto his mother. These emotions would have been symbolic because they occurred before the acquisition of real language. Yet Elvis and Gladys would come to communicate in a secret language all their own. Milk, for example, was butch. Ice cream was itty-treem. And Elvis's pet name for his mother was Satnin, which, according to Billy Smith, means a real condensed round of fattening. Elvis would pat her on the stomach and say, "Baby's going to bring you something to eat, Satnin." Gladys, for her part, called him Elvie, and sometimes naughty, as in, "You're a naughty boy." They kept it up for life. In the late 1950s, when Lamar Fike would be with the Presleys at Graceland, Elvis would rip through a paragraph of that, and I couldn't make heads or tails of it. But Gladys could, and Vernon could, and Elvis would baby talk him too. I used to sit at that breakfast bar and wouldn't understand a damn word they said, especially since Elvis had that little stutter. It was like a foreign language. Indeed, twin language is often described as like speaking in tongues, indecipherable to anyone but the twins themselves. Such behavior is not uncommon. In fact, surviving twins develop a secret language more often than not, and if the other twin isn't there, the lone twin will speak it with anyone with whom he has a close, meaningful relationship, including his mother. Even as a small child, Elvis would have had a moral uneasiness with his relationship with Gladys, precisely as he felt responsible for her. It would have left him always needing to be under the control of someone else, and yet wanting to be in control of himself and others. His perpetual need for imposing control also probably resulted from stuck grief, a phenomenon in which an individual, for whatever reason, is incapable of getting over a tragic event, such as the death of a relative or spouse. Such individuals show the same profundity of emotion over time and through the stages of grieving, as delineated by the Swiss-born psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, author of the pioneering book On Death and Dying. Elvis's grief for his dead twin and his lethal enmeshment with Gladys left him incapacitated to develop in a normal way, so that he became psychologically truncated in his ability to take on true adult responsibilities. He couldn't do it on his own, because he didn't know who he was. He'd never been able to individuate, as Whitmer put it in an interview. The grown-up Elvis would always need to rely on someone else to really help out. First Gladys, then his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, his entourage, the Memphis Mafia, and various women in his life. In short, at the core, he wanted to be infantilized, to regress, if not back to the womb, then back to childhood, to be cared for and nurtured. Says Lamar Fike, Elvis's thing with women was that they had to baby him and take care of him. This, of course, would play eternal havoc with his relationships with the opposite sex. He would forever be insecure with females his own age, feeling safer and more comfortable around younger people in general, and not really know how to interact socially or recognize the proper boundaries and borders. Because of his stuck grief, particularly after Gladys's death in 1958, he would always feel as if a part of himself were missing. This would become the most important motivator in his life. As psychologist Whitmer explains, it's not so much the idea that being with another woman meant he was cheating on the mom. It's more the whole issue of, Mom had control of me. I enjoyed Mom's having control of me. I enjoyed being enmeshed with my mom, and by the way, that's why I can never emotionally mature to anything more than 14 or 15 years old. I just can't go any further. On the surface, for the first half of his life, Elvis could push himself to behave like a normal teenager, positioned somewhere from 14 to 18 years old. but his own self-perception, his default, was about 14 or 16. As such, he continued to be attracted to 14-year-old girls up until his death at age 42, though for the most part, he saw them as innocents to be protected and wanted them to remain virgins. Unconsciously, he felt 14-year-old girls were replications of himself, and he believed they constituted his missing part. But on a more conscious level, Elvis saw most women as either mothers or playthings. One part of his mind felt and experienced sexual energy as locked in with the concept of procreation. A woman was there for making children. The other half of his mind perceived women just as toys, or as little more than hormonal releases. Because of this fact, says Whitmer, Elvis could never ever develop any kind of serious, deep, meaningful relationship with anybody else. It's as if he said, "I cannot stay in a marital, loving relationship with anybody but Gladys." Many twinless twins dwell on the sidewalk of life and have high incidences of divorce and sexual and psychological difficulties. It all goes back to issues of control, Whitmer asserts. They just don't have a sense of identity that can be joined with someone else in a significant higher union. They all say, "I am my best friend," or "my dead twin is my best friend." They think, "I can't really be married, it just doesn't work." And many of them do get married, and many of them stay married, but it's a very superficial, tangential relationship. The stillbirth of his twin, and his unnatural closeness with his mother, then rendered Elvis a hopelessly poor mate for life. When Vernon returned home from Parchman in early 1939, some folks around Tupelo regarded him as a criminal, shaking their heads and remembering when he was a deacon in the church. "Back then, people were leery, and they were not as forgiving," says Billy Smith. "If you were in jail, you were an outcast. Friends thought, it's best not to socialize because people will think you are a lot like him. It made it very difficult." But Vernon also took advantage of his situation, going off with Travis fishing, shooting, and jelly-beaning around, while Gladys was forced to get a job at Long's Laundry. Vernon was just vaccinated against work, in the view of his friend Aaron Kennedy. Never sick a day in his life, just sick of work. Gladys and Vernon fought rounds about it, and finally she shamed him into applying to the Federal Works Project Agency, a New Deal program, where he was assigned to the sanitation project in Lee County. By that summer, he'd be reclassified as a skilled carpenter on the project and bring home $52 a month. His continued good behavior after Parchman resulted in another suspension, this one for 90 days in August, and the governor granted him an indefinite suspension of his sentence that November. With such a weight off the family's shoulders, the Presleys spent a lot of time with relatives, getting together for potluck suppers where Gladys would sometimes churn ice cream in an old-time freezer. They also made their own entertainment with after-dinner singings, or simply listening to the Grand Ole Opry on Saturday nights. Sometimes they had overnight guests, Elvis sleeping on a little pallet on the front floor with his parents, and the guests on a makeshift bed in the kitchen. It was about this time, age 4, that Elvis began to recognize a connection between music and sex, and demonstrate the sexual power that music had over him. "I remember one night we went up to Gladys and Vernon's," Annie Presley said. "We were all sitting around singing, and Elvis was singing with us. Elvis had his little hand in his pocket, dangling his ding-a-ling. Vernon, all at once, just stopped singing. He could say anything and never crack a grin. So Vernon said, 'Son, if you'd just quit playing with that thing a little bit, you might could sing.' Embarrassed that kid to death. We all just hollered." Another incident from that era shows how young Elvis linked dancing and sex. When he was 4 or 5, Billy Smith reports, "My mama and Aunt Cletus were dancing together to some music. They were up on a trunk waving their skirts around, so they were flying up. Elvis was in the room, and the more they danced, the more excited he got. He grabbed my mama by the leg, and he said, "Oh, my Peter." Well, Gladys went wild. She yanked him up and yelled out, "You all quit that damn dancing." She pointed at Elvis and said, "Look what you're doing to him." When my mama told me that, I like to died. That formative memory would lead to one of Elvis's strongest sexual charges as an adult, that of two women together. And as he grew older, he would have a new name for his penis, Little Elvis. In the fall of 1941, Elvis entered first grade, attending Lawhon Elementary School on Lake Street, where he would spend the first years of his education. Starting school is a huge and often traumatic step for any child, and for Elvis it was doubly hard being separated from Gladys for most of the day, especially since Vernon had lost his Federal Works project job and traveled throughout Mississippi, Alabama, and Tennessee on construction jobs, working mostly as a carpenter. Elvis never really knew when his father would be home. The family was now living in a rental house on Maple Street in East Tupelo, and Vernon's absence, along with the experience of leaving his mother during school hours, bound mother and son anew. They often visited Jessie's grave together. Relatives would recall that Gladys urged and joined her young son in talking with the lost twin, a practice that originated from her daily prayer to Jessie for guidance. He became her mental embodiment of perfection, first in her mind alone, and then in Elvis's. After such sad outings, Gladys, wanting to cheer Elvis up, often bought little treats for him and made him cakes with butter frosting. He had his special cup, glass, and eating utensils too, and sometimes refused to use any other. Part of it had to do with a phobia about germs, particularly about eating food that anyone else had touched. Even as an adult, Elvis would drink from the side of a coffee cup, near the handle, thinking it was cleaner, since most people drank from the middle. He routinely refused to eat if someone else reached over and got something off his plate, even if it was an immediate member of his family, as Billy Smith noted. Elvis used to carry a knife and fork in his back pocket because he didn't like to eat with anybody else's. He'd eat from your dishes, but not with your silverware. He didn't break that habit until he went into the Army. Used to take that knife and fork to school with him. He didn't eat or drink after anybody, and he didn't want you to drink after him. Attending school and meeting new children opened Elvis up to a new world, something he desperately needed, given his insular family situation and the fact that he was a shy, dreamy child. Yet being with so many boys his age would have naturally underscored his grief at not having Jessie by his side. Sometime after Elvis started school, but before he was old enough to know the facts of life, Gladys inadvertently pulled a cruel trick on him, perhaps not realizing how it would affect him. Barbara Hearn, who dated Elvis during his early fame, first became a family friend when the Presleys lived on Alabama Street in Memphis. She and Gladys found an easy friendship, sitting and talking. "If you are shelling peas or something, you'd get into some pretty deep conversation," she relates. One day, Gladys told her about the time in Tupelo when she was sick and the doctor paid a house call. Elvis saw the doctor leaving, and he came running into her bedroom saying, "What's the matter? What's the matter?" Gladys had doubled a pillow up and put a blanket around it, and she said, "Oh, Elvis, come and look what the doctor's left." It looked just like a baby lying there, and he was so happy. He broke out in a big smile and ran over there, but when he saw that she was playing a joke on him, he was so disappointed and angry. It made him furious, because he really thought there had been a baby. She probably wouldn't have done it if she had thought about it a while, particularly after she saw how upset he got. I'm sure she was sorry afterward. By 1943, Vernon was working hard to stabilize his family's finances and to establish himself as a worthy citizen after his incarceration at Parchman. He continued to travel to find work, moving the whole family to the Mississippi Gulf Coast town of Pascagoula that May, where he and his cousin, Sales Presley, Annie's husband, signed on at the Moss Point shipyard. By the end of June, all the Presleys were homesick and returned to Tupelo. Vernon found a job as a driver for L.P. McCarty & Sons, a wholesale grocer, and the family continued to enjoy what must have seemed like prosperity compared to so many other stressful periods of their lives. The following year, Elvis started 4th grade at Lawhon Elementary. It was a significant time in the young boy's life, as it was probably this year that he courted his first real girlfriend, Eloise Bedford. Caroline Ballard had earlier won his heart, but the relationship was short-lived. After Elvis became famous, Eloise would forget precisely when their romance started, but she never forgot his smile, more a perpetual silly grin than anything else. "I can close my eyes now and still see him walking toward me," she said in the early 1990s. "I picked him out of all the boys. He picked me out of all the other girls. As far as dating, we didn't. We were too young." Theirs was a typical interaction for children of their age. They wrote notes to each other in class, called each other boyfriend and girlfriend, and spent time together at various events, particularly the Halloween carnival, where they entered the cakewalk. Eloise remembered him as a loner, quiet and well-mannered, wearing very common clothes, either overalls or khaki pants and shirt, but always clean. Elvis was already starting to distinguish himself with his singing. What I remember most about him was his singing in chapel at school. I can still see him singing Old Shep. It was so pretty. He had such a beautiful voice back then. I remember our 4th grade teacher, Mrs. Dillard, saying, "One of these days he is going to be on the radio." Old Shep, Red Foley's mournful story of a boy and his dog, was the kind of tearjerker that made up the backbone of country music of the era. But the tragic saga would have strongly resonated with a child who had experienced his own painful loss, and Elvis's friend Becky Martin recalled that he imbued it with such emotion that some of his schoolmates cried when he sang it. Elvis was still stuck on the song the following year, impressing his 5th grade teacher, Mrs. Oletta Grimes, the daughter of Orville Bean, who was once more doing business with Vernon, having just sold him a new 4-room house on East Tupelo's Berry Street. Mrs. Grimes found Elvis to be such a promising singer, he sang so sweetly, that she took him to the school principal, J.D. Cole, who agreed with her. The boy had talent. Mrs. Grimes spoke with Gladys, and they agreed to enter Elvis in the talent contest on Children's Day at the annual Mississippi-Alabama Fair and Dairy Show at the fairgrounds. The first-place winner would receive a trophy and a $25 war bond, and even the runners-up could go home with a smaller trophy, or at least $2.50 worth of fair rides. 10-year-old Elvis, wearing eyeglasses, a necktie, and suspenders to hold up his pants, climbed up on a chair for yet another a cappella rendition of Old Shep. For decades, the story circulated that Elvis won 2nd place, but in fact he did not, nor did he win 3rd or 4th, but rather 5th. Shirley Gillentine, who belted out "My Dreams Are Getting Better All the Time," secured 1st place, and Nubin Payne, who wrote her own song, Someday, and accompanied herself on guitar, came in 2nd. A rare photograph shows Shirley holding the largest trophy, Nubin the 2nd largest trophy, and Hugh Jeffries, an East Tupelo boy who played the Hawaiian guitar, the 3rd place prize. Elvis, a defeated look on his brow, stands empty-handed. Eloise Bedford was proud of him all the same, but later that year another girl captured Elvis's attention, and now he had to break the news. "I was just about to get on the school bus and go home that afternoon," Eloise remembered, "and Elvis handed me a note. It was short, but not sweet, saying only, 'I have found another girl.' Her name was Magdalene Morgan," Eloise continued. "I lost him that day." The event was meaningful in the larger scheme of things. Moving from Eloise to Madeline was perhaps the last time Elvis limited himself to sequential girlfriends. In years to come, and especially once his recording career caught fire, his love interests would be both many and concurrent. This was behavior he learned from both his grandfather, J.D., and to some extent, Vernon. Maggie Morgan was a far more important figure in Elvis's life than Eloise Bedford, as their interest in each other spanned several years and ran deeper on every level. And although neither of them could have known it at the time, Maggie was an archetype for so many women to come. She was a stand-in for Gladys. With dark hair and eyes and standing a good 3 inches taller than her new beau, Maggie had known Elvis since the 3rd grade at Lawhon Elementary. But it was at the Assembly of God Church that her infatuation simmered. Already the church pianist by 8 or 9, she played behind the budding singer as he performed the old hymns, Amazing Grace, The Old Rugged Cross. Vernon and Gladys did not attend church regularly, Aaron Kennedy said years later, and no one could depend on them to take a lead there. But Elvis and Maggie rode the church bus together as Christ Ambassadors, a youth group that traveled the nearby towns of Saltillo, Corinth, and Priceville, and the two were paired off together in the Christmas pageants, Elvis playing Joseph to her Mary. Gladys and Maggie's mother were friends as well, and the women visited in each other's homes. During such time, Elvis and Maggie would sneak out of the house together to be alone. We would walk in the woods and hold hands and talk, dream aloud about the future and what we wanted to be. Elvis always wanted to be a singer. That was his dream even then. And he always said the girl he would marry would have to be a lot like his mother. On one visit, Elvis and Maggie ventured out into the woods behind his house, and Elvis carved a heart into the side of a tree, carefully cutting out their initials and the words, "Love Forever," beneath them. Later, he did the same thing on a stack of lumber. The two had an understanding. They were sweethearts and belonged to each other. And as Maggie remembers, "We were so close at that time, I just thought we would always be together." Elvis didn't precisely say the same, since he wasn't much of a talker. At school, in fact, he stood out only for being an especially giving child who wanted to please. His grades weren't remarkable. Arithmetic and geography, especially, proved nearly fatal. And his features had not yet formed into a handsome face. His high cheekbones, part of his Indian ancestry, just barely discernible, and his hooded eyelids looking more droopy than dreamy. It was only when he turned to music that he seemed to shine. In Maggie's view, he was just a nice, polite boy, her ideal guy. With boys, Elvis wasn't as restrained. On Berry Street, he played with the son of Lether Gable, Vernon's partner in crime in the check-forging caper, who was now the Presleys' next-door neighbor. The boys were wrestling one day, getting rougher than they intended, when Elvis somehow snapped his playmate's hip. He felt terrible about it and, according to Annie Presley, went and sat with him every day and visited while he was laid up. And while he didn't play hooky, sass his parents, or talk back to his teachers, Elvis was a lot like his daddy in one respect, his cousin Bobby Roberts offered. Both of them were always joking. The company of men and boys, sitting around and telling stories, relaxed him. One night, one of his uncles was visiting, and he was telling us never to mess with women, that women would eat you up like blue cheese or something like that. When he said that, Elvis fell on the floor laughing. He got a big kick out of that. Still, most of his friends were females, like Becky Martin or Barbara Spencer, and he didn't mind babysitting for his relatives' children, toting them on his hip the way a girl might do. Gladys remained his whole world, as his role model, friend, companion, and protector. "I could wake her up any hour of the night," Elvis said in 1958, "and if I was worried or troubled by something, well, she'd get up and try to help me." For too many years, she walked him to school every day, and legend has it she continued such hovering behavior long after Elvis was old enough to walk on his own, or with other children his age. Annie Presley dispelled that, insisting she didn't walk him to school. She'd walk him to the highway and see him across, and then she'd come back home. Lots of evenings we'd just sit on our porch and watch for him and see him get close to the highway. Then one of us would go and see him across the road. Oletta Grimes, Elvis's fifth-grade teacher and a neighbor to the Presleys, also refuted the myth that Gladys accompanied Elvis to school, both at Lawhon Elementary and later at Milam Junior High. Being a neighbor, she told author Bill Burke in 1991, I walked with the children, and I don't remember Mrs. Presley walking Elvis to or from school, particularly during the 5th grade. He and the others walked with me most days. However, Gladys still watched her son like a hawk, even when he was playing with other children. Many of them, like first cousin Harold Lloyd, who lived with the Presleys for a while in East Tupelo, feared her and nearly prayed that nothing would happen to Elvis while they were together. I always played with Elvis real gentle when he was a kid because I knew how Gladys was. Many times I heard him say, Mama, can I go out and play? And she would say, yeah, you can go out and play in the yard, but don't you get too far away that you can't hear me if I call you. The rest of us would wander off, go down in the bottom, and go swimming in the channel. All except Elvis. He couldn't do that. He had to stay right there close to the house. My mama never let me out of her sight, Elvis confirmed in 1965. I couldn't go down to the creek with the other kids. Sometimes when I was little, I used to run off. Mama would whip me, and I thought she didn't love me. Eventually, Gladys loosened the reins enough that Elvis and his friend James Osborne could go to Tulip Creek to fish and swim. For the most part, Elvis chose devotion to Gladys over popularity with his peers. But occasionally he would challenge her in larger ways, either because the pull of joining in with the others got the best of him, or because he desperately needed to find and prove his own identity. His cousin, Bobby Roberts, recalled Gladys would tell Bobby not to let Elvis climb a tree. But he'd climb the tree anyhow, just like all boys do. He would climb right to the top of the tallest tree. She was always worried about him falling and hurting himself. Elvis also held his own in fistfights as he grew older, knowing the other kids would run over him if he didn't risk the occasional black eye or a bloody nose. Even that proved problematic with a mother like Gladys, reported playmate Odell Clark. I remember some folks next door jumped on Elvis one day, and Gladys wore 2 or 3 of them out with her brush broom, parents and all. It was not an isolated incident. Another time, remembered Christine Roberts Presley, Elvis's great-aunt and the wife of J.D.'s brother Noah Presley, Gladys got a stick after a child who came to play. He said something about Elvis, and boy, Gladys picked up a broomstick. That boy ran and hid. She said, "You come out of there or I'll whip you till you can't even walk." Yet Gladys would also discipline her son. His friend, Guy Harris, remembers the day he and Elvis decided to dig up some wild rose bushes, getting sunburned in the process. We got sun-blistered pretty bad. She fixed our lunch, and Elvis claimed he was too blistered to eat. He was trying to stay outside and away from her as much as he could because he didn't want the old switch. I used to get very angry at her when I was growing up, the adult Elvis admitted. It's a natural thing when a young person wants to go somewhere or do something and your mother won't let you. You think, why, what's wrong with you? But then later on in the years, you find out that she was right, that she was only doing it to protect you, to keep you from getting in any trouble or getting hurt. And I'm very happy that she was kind of strict on me. Very happy that it worked out the way it did. On January 8, 1946, Elvis's 11th birthday, Gladys accompanied her son to the Tupelo hardware store to buy him a present. Memories conflict as to just what he picked out. Some say a bicycle, but evidence points to a .22 caliber rifle, which he wanted more for target practice than for shooting animals. Once, when Vernon had offered to take him hunting, a Southern rite of father-son bonding, Elvis begged off. "Daddy," he said, I don't want to kill birds." Now Gladys turned to the salesman, Forrest Bobo, who lived in East Tupelo and knew the Presley family. "Is this a dangerous thing?" Gladys asked. "Sure, it's dangerous. It's a .22. You could kill somebody with it, or you could get killed by it." And so, only a few months after Elvis's competition at the Tupelo Fair, Gladys tried a different tack. "Son," she suggested, "wouldn't you rather have a guitar? It would help you with your singing, and everyone does enjoy hearing you sing." According to Billy Booth, who owned the store and heard the story directly from Bobo, Elvis threw a temper tantrum. He didn't want a guitar. He wanted a rifle. Gladys threatened a spanking for such a public scene, and then she told him he'd get nothing for his birthday if he didn't straighten up. Bobo, by his account, went back and brought out a mid-grade guitar that Elvis would later identify as a Gene Autry model. The papers always said it was $12, but it wasn't. You got a real good guitar back in those days for $12. But this was only $7.75, I believe. Of course, we had a 2-cent sales tax. Bobo handed it to him and then took Elvis behind the counter and sat him down on a shell box. Elvis tried to pick out Old Shep and reckoned he would have it after all. He got the bike, too, later on, Billy Smith remembers. Then he wrecked it and broke his arm, so he couldn't play the guitar for a while. He also got a rifle, though it had probably been Grandfather Jesse's to start with, as the initials J.D. were carved on the stock. But Elvis took full ownership, carving his own initials, E.A.P., as well as the name of a mysterious young lass, Judy. After Elvis became famous, numerous people around Tupelo took credit for teaching him the guitar, including his uncle Johnny Smith and Hubert Tipton and Hubert's brother Ernest. Reverend Frank Smith, the new pastor at the Assembly of God Church, recalled that Elvis already had a lesson book to show him where to put his fingers between the frets to form the chords. From there, the minister said, "I taught him to make his runs." In contrast to Gaines Mansell, a real humble type of seller who just tried to lead you to God but didn't try to make you do nothing, as Annie Presley put it. Reverend Smith was outspoken in his beliefs of the twin poles of sin and salvation. And one thing Elvis did not learn from Smith or anyone else connected with the Assembly of God Church, the pastor emphasized, was his sexually suggestive stage moves. "We had some body movements, very outgoing demonstrations, but nothing like what Elvis did. He did all that himself. He never copied anyone." The statement was not precisely true, though Reverend Smith might not have known it. Elvis would have a number of influences starting in July 1946, when Vernon, who struggled to make the payments on the Berry Street house, was forced to deed it over to his friend Aaron Kennedy. It was then that the Presleys moved from East Tupelo into Tupelo proper. At first, they settled on Commerce Street, but then moved to Mulberry Alley, a tiny lane that ran near the fairgrounds, the railroad tracks, the city dump, and, of incalculable importance to Elvis's musical development, the black neighborhood of Shake Rag. Just as the whites divided their social strata by Highway 78, there was a similar split in the black section of Tupelo. The prosperous blacks dwelled on the hill, reports Roy Turner, while the rowdier, less fortunate lived across the tracks, in Shake Rag. The sounds that young Elvis heard coming from the black porches, the wails, the bent notes, the low king snake moans of the blues, and the high-pitched gospel hosannas, meshed to form half of the bedrock of his musical education. But the nasal whines of Nashville's Grand Ole Opry and of local country singer Mississippi Slim on radio station WELO also found a place in Elvis's heart, especially as Slim, a.k.a. Carvel Lee Osborne, whose music bridged the blue yodel of Jimmy Rogers and the honky-tonk of Ernest Tubb, had encouraged Elvis's own singing. He studied him along with Roy Acuff, Hank Snow, and early crooner Gene Austen. About that time, Mayor Tease Finley Collins remembered. Elvis would pick up and sing in front of the Tupelo Hotel, which was almost across from the radio station on South Spring Street. People would give him 5 cents, 10 cents, or sometimes a 25-cent piece. When he got a quarter, he would run down to the laundry where his mother worked and give the quarter to her, then hurry back to the hotel. The idea of making money from music, particularly so his mother wouldn't have to work, became the engine of his dreams. Elvis's biggest fantasy in Tupelo was to one day be big enough to have his own radio show on Saturday mornings on WELO, just like his idol Mississippi Slim, said Bill Burke, who covered Elvis's career for the Memphis Press-Scimitar and wrote extensively of Elvis's roots in Mississippi. But the records of the Black Sister Rosetta Tharpe, who took the Lord's songs from the choir and congregation to the nightclubs and cabarets, enchanted Elvis in a different way. It was Tharpe, with her sharp talk about backsliding, or sinning, and the calculated way she used her guitar that particularly ignited young Elvis. Whether playing single-note solos as deftly as any male, or wielding the instrument as a prop, she used the guitar both as an extension of herself and as a vehicle for sexual innuendo. "Come on, Daddy, plug me in," she said once electric guitars became the vogue. Outrageous in every way, a spiritual cousin to Elvis's future manager, Colonel Tom Parker, she hawked perfume and stockings as well as records, and charged admission to her wedding. Musically, she also pioneered, crossing the lines from gospel to blues to jazz to boogie to big band to country, and she did it all with greasy aplomb. She would dye her hair flame red, giving her the onstage appearance of a constantly exploding corona or a halo from hell. Peter O. Whitmer wrote, "She would wear blue jeans and high heels, or wrap herself in fur boas and billowing caravan robes, and whenever she took the stage she carried her guitar, slung over her shoulder, and perfected a style of bending notes and phrasing words that was inimitable." The original Soul Sister was, in short, Elvis's most important musical role model, as influential for her personal style as for her genre-bending sound, her appearance setting up an androgynous ideal in a young boy's heart. In September 1946, Elvis entered the 6th grade at a new school, Milam Junior High. His classmates remember him as an odd boy in overalls who didn't fit in anywhere, not with the in group with money, or even the out group, which was poor. The girls considered him crazy because he flirted with nearly all of them, particularly Carolyn Brewer, whom he nominated for the Most Beautiful contest. Elvis was such a pest in that regard that some of the girls started leaving home early for school to try to avoid seeing him on the street, and pleaded with their 6th grade teacher, Mrs. Camp, to make him behave. Anyone wishing to provoke a little girl to tears of rage had only to chalk "Elvis loves" and then the girl's name on the blackboard when the teacher was out of the room, Elaine Dundee wrote. The very idea that this goof, this clodhopper, would single you out for his affection was intolerable. Yet again, Elvis stood out for his passion for music, whether it was hymns or hillbilly tunes. Maud Dean Christian remembered that the teachers closed the door and all the windows when he sang, even during the hot months, so the other kids wouldn't hear him playing guitar and want to come and listen. He trotted out Old Shep, of course, and performed it so often that it got to be something of a joke. When he'd take his place in front of the group for the morning prayer program, several of his classmates would yell out, "Oh no, not another round of Old Shep today." Still, he persisted. At recess, classmate Shirley Lumpkin noticed he would go out to the bicycle shed and sit and pick the guitar, almost always by himself. Elvis knew he was powerful only when he sang, and that he would have to win over tough audiences in the future if he was really going to be a singer. The family was experiencing a number of changes, and few of them good. By 1942, Elvis's grandfather, J.D. Presley, had deserted his wife, the flinty Minnie Mae, going first to Mobile, Alabama, and then settling in Louisville, Kentucky. Now, 4 years later, he filed for divorce, claiming Minnie Mae had deserted him in the fall of 1942, and that he'd begged her to join him in Louisville, where he worked primarily as a carpenter. Minnie Mae refused to take it lying down and answered the divorce petition with a letter written in longhand. Dear Sirs, I am writing to you about the letter I received from you last week concerning a divorce. I didn't desert my husband. As a matter of fact, he deserted me and has been living with another woman, and he hasn't sent me any money in over a year, and I am not able to make a living. We have 5 children, and they are all married and have families of their own, and I have to depend on them for a living. I want you to send me the papers to fill out, and if you want my husband's record, you can write to the Chief of Police, Elsie Carr of Tupelo, Mississippi. Sincerely yours, Mrs. Jessie Presley. 2 months later, their daughter, Delta Mae Biggs, took exception with Jessie's petition in equity and wrote a letter of her own in scrawled penmanship. Dear Sir, I am writing in behalf of Mrs. Minnie Mae Presley, which is also my mother. Tell Presley he can have a divorce if he will give Mama $200 cash. She won't ask for alimony. If he doesn't want to do that, she will not give him a divorce. He told a falsehood about several matters to you. He has 5 children, not 3. He also deserted Mama. Thanks, Delta Mae Biggs. When the divorce became final in 1948, Jesse seemed to reform. He stopped drinking, became active in his Baptist church, building the pulpit there, and married a retired schoolteacher, Vera Kennard Leftwich, with whom he'd live the rest of his days. His step-granddaughter, Iris Sermon Leftwich, considered them a good match. They used to play little tricks on each other and had a lot of fun. They each brought out the youth in the other. Jessie and Minnie Mae stayed at loggerheads. She never called him by name, only that son of a bitch. But he mended his relationship with Vernon, who kept in touch by phone and letter, and visited with him on numerous occasions, especially during Jessie's illnesses. Once Elvis's career took off, he too resumed relations with J.D., and the two exchanged birthday cards and notes. During a trip to Louisville for an appearance in 1956, Elvis bought his grandfather a snazzy new 2-tone Ford Fairlane and a television, and peeled off a crisp $100 bill to go with them. Jesse, liking a taste of fame, made a 3-song record of his own, The Roots of Elvis, and in 1958 he won a spot on the television show I've Got a Secret. There, the 62-year-old, seated in a rocking chair, sang the Billy Goat song in a high, thin tenor as host Gary Moore backed him on drums. The elder Presley, who would last work as a night watchman at the Louisville Pepsi-Cola plant, told a Toronto newspaper reporter that he didn't like rock and roll, preferring the religious and working songs he learned picking cotton in Mississippi. And no, he didn't want Elvis to help him. I want to make it on my own, he said. Elvis was amused, and the two remained friendly until J.D.'s death from heart disease in 1973. Jessie's desertion meant that Minnie Mae had nowhere to go but to her children. By 1946, she was living with Vernon, Gladys, and Elvis, whom she adored. The feeling was mutual. With her dry wit, laconic manner, and elongated body, she resembled, if not a James Agee character, then certainly a Walker Evans Depression-era photograph come to life. Gladys was glad to have her help. She did all the work, in Lillian Smith's view, and Elvis found her a comical figure. One day he was playing ball and overthrew his pitch, missing her face by a fraction of an inch. He promptly nicknamed her Dodger, a term of endearment that stuck throughout her life. The living arrangement also took hold. Vernon counted her a dependent on his 1947 tax return, and she never left the Presley household again. Minnie May would reside under the same roof as Elvis all her life and outlive her famous grandson by 3 years. By the time Elvis entered 7th grade in 1947, his mind was seldom on his studies. His grade point average was about 70, making him a C- student. But the 12-year-old felt confident enough about his musicianship to take his guitar to school with him almost every day, practicing chords and working on new songs during lunch. Classmate Roland Tyndall remembered that he announced to the class more than once that he was going to sing at the Grand Ole Opry. If the majority of his fellow students ignored him or smirked at his bid for attention, a group of bullies intolerant of another rendition of Old Shep would cut the strings off his guitar at some point. Others knew he had a shot at stardom. Most people wouldn't believe this, a classmate said years later, but I went up to him and I told him, "Elvis, one of these days you're gonna be famous." And he smiled at me and said, "I sure hope so." Maggie Morgan also supported his ambition. She'd gone with him to perform on WELO, where he still gazed motionless at hillbilly singer Mississippi Slim. And as far as she was concerned, theirs was a serious relationship. He'd told her he loved her, and she'd whispered back, "I love you too." And they'd shared 3 kisses, one during the carving of the heart on the tree, another on the swing on his parents' front porch, and the third in the car en route to a church rally. I didn't expect my life to end or go anywhere without Elvis. He was my love. He was my man. But if things were going well for the young couple, Vernon Presley was just about at the end of his rope. Living in a colored neighborhood on Tupelo's North Green Street, where Elvis heard early R&B, jump blues, and swing tunes throbbing through the walls at the nearby juke joints, the family was deeply in debt. Vernon was still driving a grocery truck and scraping to make a living. There's a story that he pretty much got kicked out of Tupelo for moonshining, says Billy Smith. And Gladys brought in a little money as a seamstress. But the bank was threatening to foreclose on a loan, and the Presleys were buying everything on time and borrowing money where they could. Gladys remembered her son's concern. Elvis would hear us worrying about our debts, and he'd say, "Don't you worry none, baby. When I grow up, I'm going to buy you a fine house and pay everything you owe at the grocery store, and get 2 Cadillacs, one for you and Daddy and one for me." Vernon and Travis Smith had already gone to Memphis scouting for work, returning after 3 weeks with no prospects. Now they decided to try again, Vernon saying, "There has to be more than this." In the fall of 1948, when Elvis was 13, the Presley and the Smith families packed everything they owned into Travis's 11-year-old green Plymouth and left overnight for Memphis to start life anew. Maggie hadn't seen Elvis since he moved to Green Street, but she was shattered at the news. It broke my heart when the Presleys announced they were moving to Memphis. For a long time after that, I cried. I missed Elvis so much. I even kept missing him after I got married and had children. I know in my heart we would have gotten married. We were very young, but we were very much in love. Secretly, Elvis, too, fantasized about their future. In 1994, his estate auctioned Vernon and Gladys's marriage license, and on the back, in a child's hand, was a testimony to a mock marriage between Elvis Presley and Magdalene Morgan. Elvis's signature in pencil was authentic, though Maggie's was not. Elvis, who had never learned to correctly spell his beloved's name, had scrawled it all out in a grand romantic gesture on September 11th, 1948, just as the family was preparing to leave Mississippi. Before he signed his next marriage license, nearly 20 years later, Elvis would become far more callous about romance. 3. Blue Heartache. With a population of 237,000, Memphis was the largest city in the Mid-South, and a serendipitous destination for the Presley family. King Cotton had built this town from the lazy banks of the Mississippi River, but in the post-World War II years, Memphis looked like a country boy in his first zoot suit, as urban and rural cultures came together to bolster the city as a regional hub of commerce and culture, and to move it from an architectural to an industrial mecca. Though middle-class jobs were not yet plentiful, opportunity crackled in the air, as if change itself were a seed in the fertile Mississippi Delta, and the mere size of the city meant that an ex-con like Vernon could reinvent himself with new friends and employers, and perhaps even with his wife. Gladys was so energized by the move that she seemed to enjoy her husband's advances. An early friend of Elvis, remembering that Vernon was always hugging her and kissing her and showing her affection, he could never keep his hands off her. For Elvis, 13 and just coming into puberty, everything was exciting and new. Still burning with the fire to be a singer, he was exhilarated to find himself smack in the home of the blues, historically a woeful or triumphal form of musical salvation, summoned in the cries and the catharsis of the worried and the worn down. Before long, he would be poking around on Beale Street, staring at the photographs in the window of the blue light studio, his ears tuned to the music. Solo guitarists, wailing vocalists, harmonica players, or maybe just guitar and drum groups pouring out of the smoky clubs. Music was everywhere on Beale Street. Men even played saxophone in the park. Sometimes he'd meander over to North Main, every now and then summoning the courage to walk into the Green Owl, a black beer joint where people spilled out onto the sidewalk on weekend nights. Elvis was wide-eyed at the city slickers and the pimped-up dandies in their bright Lansky Brothers clothes, and even more so at the women whose illegal turns helped buy them. He was also enthralled by the musicians, slack-jawed blacks who played with their eyes closed, a cigarette or something stronger tugging at the corners of their lips. And he especially got a kick out of the guy who made a bass out of a 5-gallon bucket and a broom handle. Though he was too young to be in there, it was worth a rough little reprimand to hear the wild, wanton sounds of the blue notes, and to feel his own libido ripple down below. When they first arrived in the Bluff City, the Presleys, Vernon, Gladys, Elvis, Minnie May, and the Smiths, Travis, Lorraine, Bobby, Billy, stuck together like immigrants in a new land, clutching their few belongings, fearful of the loud sounds of the city, and straining their ears at the oddity of the new language. Elvis had been there before on Noah Presley's bus trips to the zoo and for picnics and concerts at the Overton Park Shell. But in a sense, they were all just that, strangers in a strange land. Memphis was only 90 miles northwest of Tupelo, but it might as well have been 1,000. Pooling their resources, Travis had sold 2 cows and killed a hog to get just over $100. The families found lodging in a cheap wooden rooming house at 370 Washington Street in North Memphis in the Pinchgut district, a haven to newcomers since the Irish settled there in the 1820s, the Jews joining them in the early 1900s. The Smiths took the upstairs apartment and the Presleys the downstairs, and they shared the communal bath. Rent for each family, $11 a week. Tough and slummy, with prostitutes mixing with flatboat traders along the streets lined with delicatessens, 5-and-dime stores, and brawl house bars. The neighborhood derived its funny name from the saying that the Irish were so starved, their stomachs so taut from hunger, that you couldn't pinch any loose skin on their middles. Later, the name got shortened to Pinch. Billy Smith, 8 years younger than Elvis, remembers that the situation was nearly as dire for the Presleys and the Smiths when the family settled in. Daddy and Vernon spent weeks looking for work. They had to put cardboard in their shoes to cover the holes. For months, it seemed, they survived on turnip greens, seasoned with part of the salt pork from the slaughtered hog. Then, 5-year-old Billy discovered that the produce stand next door threw rotting fruit and vegetables into the trash cans each night. I remember going through there and finding bruised bananas to eat. When you're that poor, you scavenge for what you can eat. Elvis loved to tell about the time I fell into one of the 55-gallon trash cans. I was so little that he had to pick me up by my legs and pull me out. But I wasn't turning a loose of them damn bananas. For a while, the families pondered moving back to Mississippi. But then both Vernon and Travis found employment at the Precision Tool Company on Kansas Street in South Memphis. Soon Elvis's uncle, Johnny Smith, moved up from Tupelo and was hired there too. And Gladys, calling on her seamstress skills, took a part-time job in a drapery factory, Lorraine finding work at a laundry. Precisely when Elvis started going to school in Memphis is open to question. Gladys's sister, Lillian, said he attended the Christine School for a short while, though there is no evidence to support it. What is known is that on November 8, 1948, Elvis Aaron Presley enrolled in the 8th grade at L.C. Humes High School, a traditionally white institution in a rough neighborhood in a mostly segregated city. It already had a bad reputation. Vernon walked him to school that first day and was astonished to see his son back home shortly after. So nervous he was bug-eyed, as Vernon put it. But he soon adjusted. Records show he was present 165 days that year and absent 15, but never tardy. His grades improved from Tupelo, Elvis bringing home an A in language, a B in spelling, history and physical education, and a C in arithmetic, science, and music. The C in music would have pierced his ego. Elvis seemed more reticent about performing in public once the family moved to Memphis, perhaps because the town was full of music, a Mississippi blues man on every corner, a tip jar at his feet. Even at home, he insisted that the lights be off so nobody could see him when he practiced his guitar. I was ashamed to sing in front of anybody except my mother and daddy, Elvis would say in 1956. He never did learn much more than a few major chords and a couple of easy runs. But they did the trick, and he could beat on the guitar with the meat of his palm for a percussive sound. He was trying different songs now. K-Star's pop ballad, Harbor Lights, and Molly Darling, a hillbilly number made popular by Eddie Arnold, whose career was taking flight under the guidance of his new manager, a former carny who went by the name of Colonel Tom Parker. Sometimes at night, Elvis would take his guitar outside to see how it all sounded in the evening air, and Vernon and Gladys would spread an old quilt down on the ground so they could sit and listen, even though Elvis's voice, quavering slightly, seldom rose above a whisper. In spring 1949, both the Presley and Smith families were still struggling financially. Vernon applied for public housing and left Precision Tool for a job at United Paint Company, which was closer to home. He stayed there longer than anywhere, says Billy Smith. Usually, he'd get a couple of paychecks, and that would be about it. At the time, with everybody working, the two families made a combined total of about $120 a week. Vernon bringing home $40.38 at 85 cents per hour. The Presleys and the Smiths soon split up for nearby rooming houses, one on Adams and the other on Poplar. But with no one else to depend on, the family held tight. Soon they would welcome Gladys's sister, Laval, and her husband, Edward Smith, and their children, Junior and Jean, up from Mississippi. In June 1949, Jane Richardson, a home service advisor for the Memphis Housing Authority, followed up on Vernon's application and visited the Presleys' rented room, for which they paid $9.50 a week. With Vernon at work, Miss Richardson met with Gladys and Elvis, noting that the family shared a bathroom with other residents and cooked on a hot plate. Miss Richardson went back to her office and wrote her report, indicating that the Presleys' application had merit. She added that Mrs. Presley and her son seemed very nice and deserving. That November, they moved into Lauderdale Courts, right around the corner from where they were living, and paid $35 a month for a 2-bedroom, first-floor unit at 185 Winchester Street. With 689 square feet, apartment 328 had a living room, bathroom, and walk-in kitchen. Residents were expected to keep the apartments clean, and inspectors came around once a month to make sure of that, and to see that no one had accumulated too many material goods, as any sign of affluence would put them at risk for eviction. Lauderdale Courts, consisting of 66 red brick buildings on 22 acres, was one of the first U.S. housing projects, and most occupants felt fortunate to be there, even as they hoped not to stay. Its motto, from slums to public housing to private ownership. Billy Smith saw how thrilled Gladys was with the place. I have this vivid memory of going over to Lauderdale Courts one summer when Elvis was at Hume's. They were playing music, and Gladys was dancing, and they were having a ball. She was always jolly then, always laughing and carrying on. The Presleys were one of 17 new families who moved into the Courts around that time, though they differed in that most were single-parent households. Elvis, at 14, began quietly making new contacts, playing guitar with a group of older boys under the trees at Market Mall, the path that bisected the housing development. For the most part, he stayed in the background, watching and listening to what he could pick up from the more experienced musicians, and then went home and sat on his bedroom windowsill and practiced, sometimes going down to the basement laundry room so no one would hear him. He was making personal friends, too, especially with 3 other boys from the Courts about his age, Buzzy Forbes, Paul Doer, and Farley Guy. The trio became so close that they were seemingly inseparable, but it was Buzzy, and not George Klein or Red West, who became Elvis's best friend during his years at Hume's. They banded together to do odd jobs, cutting grass with a push mower and a hand sickle for $2 a yard, and walked up on Main Street to the movies at the Suzor No. 2, or the Rialto out on Jackson. Man, we really liked Victor Mature and Samson and Delilah, Buzzy remembered. Sometimes they played pool at the Odd Fellows Hall, Elvis liking 8-ball and rotation. Mostly they played corkball with a cut-off broom or mop handle, adhesive tape wrapped around a simple cork to serve as a ball. One day, Farley spit on the corkball stick, trying to emulate Buzzy's habit of spitting through his teeth. Elvis didn't see him, didn't realize what he was doing, though when he picked up the stick, he instantly realized what was on it. By his teen years, Elvis had developed a hair-trigger temper, and in a second, he had Farley in the air. "I grabbed a peach soda bottle on the way up," says Farley. "I told him, 'Elvis, if you don't put me down, I'm going to crown you with this bottle.'" Suddenly, all hell broke loose. Gladys shouting out of her window, and Farley's mother, too. Elvis hauled off and hit Farley hard, and as his little sister Doris remembers it, Farley said, "Okay, you've got me. Now it's my time to hit you." And Mrs. Presley came running out there yelling, "Don't hit my boy." Later that day, she told my mother, "We can't have Farley going around hitting my boy." But my mother told Mrs. Presley that boys would be boys, and it was best if grown-ups did not get involved. She was one domineering woman. Elvis and Farley shook hands and were friends again, but Elvis was gaining a reputation as a boy who could take care of himself. When one of his uncles got in trouble in a bar, it was Elvis he called. And once, when Humes played a rival school, Treadwell, Elvis cold-cocked a Treadwell player who cursed the Humes coach, knocking him all the way back into the bus, as Buzzy recalls. It was a way for him to work off steam and deal with the hormonal pull of puberty, if not to distance himself from Gladys. Now that they lived in the big city, she wanted to walk Elvis to school again, fearing for him when he crossed the street by himself. For a little while, she simply followed him, darting behind bushes so Elvis wouldn't see her. Sometimes at night, in foreshadowing how the adult Elvis would interact with his entourage, the boys played tag on their bikes, Buzzy remembering that they raced at one another full force. It's a wonder we didn't get killed. If they could scrape together 10 cents, they went swimming at Malone Pool. But Elvis liked to save his money for pinball at a beer joint up at 3rd and Jackson, or for special occasions like the Cotton Carnival. Once they saw burlesque entertainer Gypsy Rose Lee there. Elvis froze in his tracks, watching as if transfixed. Often they made their own entertainment. When his parents were out for the evening, Elvis sometimes held dances in the Presleys' apartment, with a phonograph and the few records the kids had between them. Each boy pitched in 25 cents for himself and his date, just enough for popcorn and Cokes. None of us was rich enough then to just have a quarter, Buzzy remembered, so we would save all week, a nickel a day, to get up enough money to go to the dance in Elvis's apartment. Elvis, trying to overcome his shyness, pulled out his guitar and sang. He was working on Hank Williams's Call-Liga, and initially he brought a girl from the 3rd floor named Betty Ann McMahon, also 14. She was his first love in the courts. Gladys had met her even before Elvis, through her mother. The two women struck up a conversation outside one warm evening and continued it most nights in the McMahons' lawn chairs, Betty soon sitting in. Elvis, though, was too shy to join them. Finally, one night, I guess, she just forced him to come outside and sit with us and talk, as Betty remembered it. One day, their neighbor, Margaret Cranfill, took a photograph of Elvis and Betty sitting on the curb on Winchester, both of them in dungarees with the hems rolled up into neat cuffs. Twins. In it, the dark-haired Betty, her arm propped up and her chin in her hand, offers a closed smile for the camera. But a melancholy Elvis looks as if Betty has just told him goodbye, and perhaps she had. Their romance ended when a boy from Arkansas stole her affections, though Elvis's attraction to women whose appearance was remarkably similar to his was to be a nearly constant feature in his future choice of companions. In the early days of his career, Elvis told a reporter he'd gotten his heart broken in high school. A gal he thought a lot of suddenly quit seeing him. For that reason, he said, he'd had trouble allowing himself to be fond of just one girl. Whether that was Betty McMahon or her successors, Elvis began seeing Billy Wardlaw before Betty broke up with him. Billy, Betty's next-door neighbor, moved in with her mother, Thelma, in 1950, the year she turned 14. She was already so tall and pretty, with her long dark hair, that before she moved from her native Sardis, Mississippi, her grandmother had warned, "Now, Billy, you better not go up there to Memphis and get pregnant and embarrass your mother." Billy had never even heard the word pregnant before and didn't know what it meant, but when she immediately turned the heads of all the boys in the courts, she took heed. All the kids kept trying to get me to leave our 3rd-floor apartment and come down and play with them, but I would just hang out the window and talk to them. I told them the reason I couldn't come down was because I didn't have any clothes to wear. I would just keep hanging out the window and talking. Elvis, by now 15, was smitten with the mysterious girl peering down from above, especially since she'd teased that she had no clothes. He'd told her his name and exchanged pleasantries. I'm from Mississippi, too. And after a few weeks, while the other boys waited her out, treating her like a princess in some fairy tale tower, Elvis took matters in hand. One day, Billy heard a knock on the door and opened it to find him standing there, holding something behind his back. They giggled a bit the way teenagers do, nervous in the first throes of courtship, and then Elvis shifted the package in his hands and held it out to her. "Here," he said, "I brought you something." I opened the package, and it was a pair of blue jeans, The first pair of blue jeans I ever had. Elvis said, "Now you can come down and play with us." Elvis's idea of play was the old kissing game of spin the bottle. And as the kids of the courts numbered about 13 and always hung out together, the game was almost evenly split between boys and girls. Farley's little sister, the tomboy Doris, joined in, as did Luther Knoll's kid sis, Jerry. She was always photographing Elvis with her little camera and had a mad crush on him, even though he thought of Jerry as his little sister, popping her with a wet towel at the pool one day and accidentally scarring her leg. When dark came and somebody suggested spin the bottle, all the girls got excited, including Billy. Elvis was a great kisser. We always hoped the bottle would land on him. From the start of their relationship, Elvis was possessive. He'd had other flirtations with Joanne Lawhorn and another Joanne over at Bickford Park, who came to some of the group parties at the courts with him. He'd tried to get something started with Carolyn Poole at school. And he tried with Georgia Avgaris, too, throwing wadded-up gum wrappers at her in class to get her attention. But she was Greek Orthodox and not allowed to date outside her religion. Besides, his feelings for Billy were different. One day they had a spat and she began flirting with Farley, who found himself in a tough spot. Elvis didn't like that at all, and we had a discussion over it. But it all blew over quickly. "I think she just thought of him as a friend," Farley's sister Doris said, and since Elvis had a deathly crush on Billy, he enlisted Doris's help. He was all the time getting me to go up and knock on her door and ask her to come down. Sometimes he would take his guitar into the courtyard and sing to her under her window, sort of like a modern-day Romeo and Juliet. He was crazy about her. Billy confirmed it years later. We really liked each other, but I think he liked me just a little more than I liked him. Her mother worked nights some, and Elvis would come up to Billy's apartment, but she never let him in while she was alone. Everybody knew who did what and when and how at the courts, so the two just sat on the steps and talked. One night, she asked him to teach her how to play the guitar, and he brought it up and showed her where to put her fingers on the fretboard to make the chords. Elvis tried to deepen her affection, proffering a box of cherries, and then a necklace and bracelet that Billy always suspected he'd bought for Betty and took back when they broke up. He went to great lengths. One day, Billy's little sister peered out the window and couldn't believe her eyes. "Look at that. Elvis is climbing up that sign across the street." Billy shook her head. Why was Elvis being so silly? Her sister thought she was cruel, but Billy refused to acknowledge him. I wanted him to grow up. They walked to school together to save a dime and sometimes went to the movies at the Suzors. Elvis loved the dreamy escapism of the movies, his interests maturing from watching cowboy pictures to studying Tony Curtis, with his shiny black hair and knack for winning the girls. In the fall of 1950, Elvis applied for his Social Security card, and shortly after, he and Luther Knoll got night jobs as ushers at Lowe's State Movie Theater on South Main, where they wore uniforms to work. The job promised the delicious perk of letting them see the movies free. But like all twinless twins, Elvis had a fascination with uniforms and loved wearing his usher suit. It not only gave him an air of authority, but also made him look like Luther and all the other male employees, making him feel as if he belonged to a special group. That's one reason he joined ROTC at Hume's that year, in the 10th grade. Fannie Mae Crowder, who saw him in the halls a lot, noticed, "About every time I saw him, he was wearing his ROTC uniform, as if that was all he had to wear." And Doris Guy remembered how proud he was of it, all dressed up, and how he needed to show it off, organizing all the younger kids in the courts as his soldiers, making them march back and forth, all around in the courtyard when he got home in the afternoons. The only drawback was that his ROTC duties sometimes cut into the time he hoped to spend with Billy. But Billy, too, had responsibilities, working after school and on weekends at Britling's cafeteria, where both her mother and Gladys had also been employed. Gladys eventually leaving that job to become a nurse's aide at St. Joseph's Hospital. Working around everybody's schedule curtailed the young couple's outings, so most of what they did was right around the courts. Their romance was chaste. "We were never doing anything we shouldn't have been doing," she said, even after 16-year-old Elvis took his driver's test in 1951 in his Uncle Travis's 1940 Buick. Now that he had his license, he borrowed cars for double dates with his cousin, Gene, or Luther, or the other guys around the courts. He was growing up fast, getting handsome, and gaining confidence in himself. That summer, he took a job operating a spindle drill press and making rocket shells at Precision Tool, where Travis still worked. Each Friday, he came home and gave his paycheck to his father, taking out only a little for dating. If he had any money left over, he would go to Lansky Brothers on Beale Street and buy flamboyant clothing. Gladys had always made sure that his clothes were neat and clean. He may not have had many clothes, but what he had was nice and pretty much up to date, says Billy Smith. But his interests now ran along the lines of hepcat threads, two-tone pants and shirts with crazy piping, yellow or maybe pink. In an era of crew cuts, he also attempted to grow sideburns and paid obsessive attention to his hair, which had darkened to a dull, pale blonde in puberty. The girls at the courts teased him about looking in the mirror all the time, and they said his hair was so long and straight that it hung down to his chin when he combed it forward. Elvis would grin and explain that's why he was combing it, to keep it from falling down on his face. He finally styled it into a goopy wall of rose oil tonic, Vaseline, or Royal Crown pomade, which made it all look darker. In time, building on the Tony Curtis look and the hero of his comic books, Captain Marvel Jr., he would sculpt a perfect pompadour, which curled into a greasy ducktail at the nape of his neck. The family was now paying $43 a month for housing at the courts, but Vernon was out of work, claiming a bad back. He used the excuse to let Gladys and Elvis support him much of the time, and that led to strained relationships between father and son, Elvis sometimes talking back to his father, but never his mother. He acted out in other ways, too, getting in trouble for skipping school to go swimming in Wolf River with Luther, and earning a paddling from school principal T.C. Brindley. Still, in the summer of 1952, just before Elvis's senior year at Hume's, Vernon staked him to a 1941 green two-door Lincoln that Elvis and Luther found in a junk car lot. The cost? $35. "My daddy was something wonderful to me," Elvis would say about the car, since it was a rarity for a high school boy to have his own wheels, especially one whose family lived in government housing. Buzzy remembers Elvis driving him to Tupelo to show him where he'd grown up, just to have something to do. He took Luther one time, too, even though the tires were so thin on the old Lincoln that Luther didn't think they'd make it down and back. One night, Elvis drove the whole gang down to Mississippi, this time to Water Valley, where Billy's relatives lived. She was having some kind of party down there, as Farley remembered it. But try as he did, Elvis couldn't seem to impress any of Billy's family except her mother, who told him he sang well enough to be on the radio. Elvis blushed and stammered, and finally said, "Mrs. Rooker, I can't sing." Once, the couple rode the bus to the end of the line to have dinner with Billy's older sister. Billy was embarrassed at Elvis's table manners, since he ate everything with a spoon and never touched his fork. Not then, and not at any meal I had with him later. It was bizarre, she thought, and she noted that when they ate with his parents, he had a special platter, and he wouldn't eat from anything but that platter. The boy was odd, yes, but so many of the silly things he did seemed like kid stuff. Even though she was younger, she thought she had simply matured faster, and it bothered her. Then she began to see his temper, as on the day he spotted another boy's picture in her purse and just went wild. He grabbed it out, and without saying anything, he threw that picture on the ground and began stomping it and grinding it into the ground with the heel of his shoe. Billy had never seen Elvis like that, and it shocked and frightened her. They'd been going together for 1.5 years by now, and more Billy found things about Elvis she didn't like, including the fact that he didn't dance. He and his friends may have held parties in the Presley's apartment, but the truth was he couldn't dance, not really. He could slow dance, everybody could do that, drape yourself onto a partner and inch around in a circle. But he couldn't fast dance with a girl, and he didn't know the sophisticated dance steps for big band music. And dancing, it turned out, was something Billy really wanted to do. After work, she and her mother walked by the USO clubs on 3rd Street on their way home, and now she began asking permission to stay at the club for a few hours and dance with the military men. Elvis noticed her hanging out with other guys, particularly a sailor she'd met there, and he was furious. For a boy who'd gotten his first erection watching his aunts dance to fast music, it was all too intimate, a betrayal of the most treacherous sort, even if there was no actual sex involved. His head swirled with emotions, and he could hardly get his words out. They tumbled all over one another in a cascade of pain. Billy couldn't take it another second. I finally had to tell him, "Elvis, I am going to begin seeing other boys." His reaction surprised her. He started crying. Until that night, I had never seen a man or a boy cry. He told me, "Billy, I was going to ask you to marry me." Billy was stunned. Marriage certainly wasn't on her mind, and she had no idea it was on his. But now there was nothing to do but break up, even as Elvis kept tabs on her, just happening to show up at the cafeteria, for instance, and at the Cotton Carnival the same night she went. "Look, there's Elvis," her girlfriend said. The way he looked, he was impossible not to notice. But Billy acted as if she didn't see him, though there was no escaping him at the courts. The trauma of losing Billy triggered his sleepwalking again. One night, he woke up on the stairs outside his apartment, wearing only his underwear. Suddenly, he heard Billy come in with her date, and he ran and hid, crouching, afraid to move while she kissed the boy goodnight. For a while, they tried to be friends, but Elvis's heart was broken, and there was no fixing it, not even after Billy moved back to Mississippi. Though she is a minor name in the Elvis saga, Billy Wardlaw was a progenitor for many of the women to follow. Her coloring, particularly her dark hair, would have made her seem like his twin, a female version of himself. It's one reason he spent money well beyond his reach for a pair of blue jeans for her, as they matched his own, as Betty's had. And her size, she was big-boned, though not overweight, would have reminded Elvis of the young Gladys, which is why he had intended to propose marriage, to complete his psychological circle. At an unconscious level, we are always seeking resolutions to childhood dilemmas, writes psychologist Charlotte Davis Castle in her groundbreaking book, Women, Sex, and Addiction, A Search for Love and Power. On some level, we're looking for a second chance, to get what we missed the first time around. By attracting people similar to those in our families, we are given a chance to heal ourselves, to learn the lesson inherent to our childhood situations. In courting Billy, Elvis was attempting to separate himself from his mother and the pain of having lost his twin, even as Billy represented both. A happy relationship with her would have allowed him the chance to obliterate the guilt of surviving when Jesse did not, as well as quell the eternal loneliness of losing his twin and the pain Jesse's death had caused their mother. It also would have blunted the sexual shame of covert incest. The fact that Billy spurned him only added to his core belief that he wasn't lovable. He would have felt terribly empty and rejected, not just as a boyfriend, but also as a person. Finally, his violent outbursts at finding another boy's picture in Billy's purse, and his tears at learning she was dating a sailor were predictable escapes. As an adult, still dealing with the seeds of destruction planted in childhood, Elvis would turn that violence inward, deflecting his loneliness and fear with prescription drugs and overeating. At the start of his senior year, in the fall of 1952, Elvis was being stretched in all directions, practicing his music, trying to keep up a C average, and working long hours, first for the Upholsterers Specialty Company, and then for Marl Metal Products, a furniture manufacturer, on the 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. shift, using hand tools and an electric screw drill to make plastic tables. The strain started to show. He was falling asleep in class, and so Gladys had him quit. However, the family faced a greater dilemma that November when the Memphis Housing Authority sent the Presleys an eviction notice and ordered them to vacate by the end of February. The reason? With a combined income of $4,133, they had exceeded the limit allowed for residents of subsidized housing. In January 1953, they left the courts and moved to 698 Saffaran Street, across from Hume's. 3 months later, they packed up again, this time landing in an apartment in a large 2-story brick home at 462 Alabama, an integrated street where they would pay $50 a month in rent plus utilities. Minnie May bunked on a cot in the dining room, and Elvis slept on the sofa. The Presleys were now out of government housing, but the move to Alabama Street could not be considered upward mobility for the family in any way, as the apartment consisted of a couple of small rooms and a large kitchen. They still weren't doing all that well financially, and the courts were located right across the street. In March, Elvis visited the Tennessee State Employment Security Office, saying he would like work as a machinist. The interviewer took his information and then noted on his application that his appearance as a rather flashily dressed playboy type is denied by fact he has worked hard past 3 summers, wants a job dealing with people. Elvis had never really found his place in high school, but now, in his senior year, he was about to have 2 powerful supporters. The first was George Klein, who he'd met in music class the year he started at Hume's. They had 2 things in common. They were both eaten up with music, and they shared a worshipful love of radio, George hoping to make a career in it. Elvis had impressed him that first year by performing Old Shep and Cold, Cold, Icy Fingers for his classmates. When Elvis raised his hand and asked permission, there were a few laughs in the class because it just wasn't cool in 1948 to do that in front of anyone. I was blown away because I'd never seen a kid get up and sing like that. As they approached their senior year, George became class president and thus had some political clout. The 2 wouldn't really become close until after they graduated, but George paid attention to him, and Elvis never forgot it. His second ally was Robert Gene West, nicknamed Red for his carrot-colored hair, buzzed into a crew cut. An all-Memphis football star, Red was a year behind Elvis, who had quit the team almost immediately after he joined. To start with, at 145 pounds, he was too light, which made him self-conscious about school sports. Besides, he didn't like to wear the helmet. It messed up his hair, and he needed to get an after-school job. Sometimes he didn't have the 15 cents for lunch, and Coach Rube Boyce would give it to him. Red West, taut and muscular, had a reputation for being a quick man with his fists, and in the late summer, early fall of 1952, Elvis needed a little protection. While everyone else wore jeans and t-shirts, Elvis favored dress pants, and just to be different, he often wore a scarf fashioned into an ascot, like a movie star. Everything about his appearance made him a natural target. Red had stopped at his locker to get his football gear one afternoon just after the bell rang and saw Elvis leaning against the wall. They had spoken before, but the hierarchy of high school had prevented them from becoming friends. Now Elvis could use one. Red could tell that something was up, and Elvis spilled it out. "There's 3 guys outside who are going to beat me up." Red nodded and said, "Let's go check on it." Outside, Red had a persuasive talk with the ringleader, and all ended peacefully. The following day, Elvis caught him after class and gave him a bashful smile. "Thanks a lot for yesterday." Red smiled back. "Forget it, man." Not long after, Red walked into the boys' bathroom and found Elvis in trouble again. 3 guys had him pushed up against the wall, taunting him about his hair and threatening to cut it. Red saw a look of real fear on his face, like a frightened little animal. He knew the guys from the football squad and laid it on the line. Elvis liked his hair like that, and if they cut it, they'd have to cut Red's too. They did it just to make themselves feel big, and I intervened and stopped it, and I guess it stuck. That April, Elvis learned that Red had a musical side when they both performed in Humes's annual minstrel show, a variety program featuring the school band and various soloists, from the Arwood twins, billed as twirlers, to dancer Gloria Trout. A fundraiser, the show was scheduled for a Thursday evening and was not expected to change anybody's life. Elvis, listed 16th on the program, and identified as guitarist Elvis Presley, it was misspelled, told only a couple of friends about it, and even then they thought he might bow out. He'd sung once at a Christmas party in biology class, but that was about it. Now he was ready to go in Buzzy's red flannel shirt. He'd accidentally torn a hole in it when he put it in the closet, and he'd rolled up the sleeves so it wouldn't show. Red, who played trumpet, had put together a little trio with a guitar and bass, and he'd just finished his act when he saw Elvis come out with his guitar. "I never thought he would have the guts to get out there in front of those people," Red wrote. "I never even knew he sang." When Elvis first ambled out on stage, he looked the least prepared of all the performers. He seemed unsure of what to say or even do. He fumbled around with his guitar, and then, with the lights bothering him, turned his head sideways, eyeing the audience through slits. He stood there too long for anyone's comfort, at least a full minute, as if he might bolt. Finally, waves of talent and ambition crashed inside him, and he launched into his first number, Teresa Brewer's new chart topper, "Till I Waltz Again with You." Quietly, Elvis had been doing more than working on his ballads. He'd been experimenting with fast numbers, jumping around a little, just enough to put some pizzazz into it all. The teens in the courts danced to a 1-2-3 bop beat, but Buzzy watched Elvis develop his own crazy rhythmic step, adding 4-5-6 to the 1-2-3. He tried it out in front of 8 or 10 kids at the jukebox in the grocery store that Farley's brother-in-law owned. He also practiced in front of his family, Billy Smith remembers. "We got a piano that Christmas, and Elvis came over to our house. He started playing something fairly fast, what little he could play piano, and then he got to moving around a lot, and it was a sight to see. I thought, gosh, that's weird to see him jump around like that and sing. He'd just done it for a few minutes, and he quit. He was trying to find something that fit him, and when he did, all at once, it just broke loose what was inside him." Now, on stage at the minstrel show, he started his second song. Nobody seems to remember what it was, but Franny Mae Crowder swears it was the moment when the real Elvis was born. He was moving all over that stage, and his movements didn't start with his hips. They started with his knees and worked their way up. And then, in a flash, it was over. At first, Red remembered, he just stood there, surprised as hell. The audience, too, seemed stunned. Nobody had ever seen a guy move like that. What was he doing? And how did he do it? This dunce with the impossible hair. The place went crazy. "It was amazing," Elvis said later, "how popular I became after that." He performed every chance he got, toting his guitar to school. All the same, some of the girls thought he was just too over the top, and when he would start to sing, they'd whisper, "Not again." He still had few real friends at Hume's aside from Red and George. In early 1953, he went to a birthday party a few blocks from the courts and ran into Regis Wilson, 14, who was there with two girlfriends, Carol McCracken and Judy Gassell. Regis, a petite girl with blonde hair and a big smile, had formerly lived at the courts for 6 years with her divorced mother and 5 siblings, including her brother Jim, who was Elvis's age, and hung out with him around the complex. Regis had a crush on Elvis, who she considered a gentle soul, but all boy. He kind of had this swagger to him. She used to see him playing football in the Triangle, the grassy open field at the complex. But she'd never spoken to him and never thought he'd paid any attention to her. He seemed too interested in Betty or Billy. Of course, he was a weird dresser, in his yellow sport coat with brown trim, and he had a case of teenage acne. But from day one, she remembers, I thought he was cute. She lived in a rooming house on Merriweather Street, a bus ride away, and hadn't expected to see Elvis again. But there he was, and he was talking to her. And he still had those sideburns she'd always liked. He was a loner, a looker, very sexy with slicked back hair. They played spin the bottle that night, and Regis's girlfriends, miffed that she had kissed a boy they liked, went off and left her by herself when their ride came. Regis was stranded. I didn't have anybody I could call to come pick me up, because by then, my 4 older siblings had left home and my mother didn't have a car. Elvis offered to drive her, and she nervously agreed. She'd never been alone in a car with a boy before. And in fact, she'd never dated. She was a 9th grader at the all-girl Holy Names, the poorest Catholic school in Memphis. But when they got to her front porch and Elvis asked for her phone number, I knew I wanted to see him. Though he was 18, the 4-year age gap didn't bother either one of them. Growing up in housing projects with a single mom, 5 other kids, and a very dysfunctional family background, I pretty much raised myself, says Regis. So I was 14, but I was a very mature 14. And Elvis, still stinging from Billy's cruel rebuff, found the relationship with Regis finally put him in a position of control and made him feel like something of an older brother. Psychologically, his attraction to her was more complex. Because his stunted emotional growth left him unable to move much past 14, Regis wasn't just a little buddy, but a replication of himself. Unconsciously, 14 would now be the magic age for so many of his future romantic interests. When they first began dating, Elvis worked at night part-time, ushering at Lowe's. At some point, he was fired after an altercation with another usher, who complained that a concession stand girl gave him free candy. His usual habit would be to drop by Regis's place in the afternoon, sometimes waiting for her when she got home from school. But she never knew exactly when he was coming, and she never invited him in. My mother had had another child, and still no husband, and I was left at home with this 2-year-old. My family life was so chaotic that I just couldn't talk about it to him. Regis was also embarrassed that her family didn't actually own the house, an immaculate, large brick home with flowers in the yard, but simply lived in one rented room. Pretty soon, she couldn't tell him because Elvis thought otherwise, and his imagination had run away with him. He used to say, "One of these days I'm going to buy my mama a house like this," and he told her about his twin. Often they simply sat in the glider on the screened-in porch and talked. His humor was the type that he could just come out with funny remarks. And sometimes he sang to her with his guitar, just strumming and humming. He was working on a new ballad, My Happiness, and he sang that to her too, his baritone, melancholy and soft, floating on the humid air. She was amazed that someone as shy as he was could put his heart on the line like that. He sang it so tenderly, it seemed like it held a lot of emotion for him. Evening shadows make me blue when each weary day is through. How I long to be with you, my happiness. Soon he began courting her in the evening, too. His worn-out Lincoln had a little seat in the back, and sometimes his cousin, Gene Smith, and his girl would double date. They made the usual teenage excursions, riding over to West Memphis, Arkansas, for a drive-in movie and popcorn, or the teen canteen at McKellar Lake for hamburgers and shakes. Sometimes they just went tooling around. He was a very simple, sweet person. He thoroughly enjoyed just sitting there watching the Mississippi River roll by, and he loved driving cars. As he had been with Billy, Elvis was a consummate gentleman. His looks completely belied his behavior. If you were to see him on the street, you'd probably think he was a hoodlum. At 14, she didn't think she could really be in love with someone, but she liked him a lot. She kissed him every night from the second date on, and she had her expectations. Carol and Judy still hung out around the courts and reported he was a good kisser. And I wanted to see for myself. She had heard he knew how to kiss in that deep way, but that presented a dilemma. The nuns at my school told us we shouldn't allow boys to kiss us with their mouths open, so I'll just say Elvis gave me long kisses. You could say we made out, but he never tried to go farther. He wasn't like that. Regis knew he was serious about music, but he was so modest he never even mentioned his big success at the Humes Minstrel Show. One of his favorite things to do was to take her to the all-night gospel singings at Ellis Auditorium, where the Statesmen and the Blackwood Brothers would perform. About 2 a.m, I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer, and we'd leave. But Elvis could have lasted until dawn. Some of those spirituals had big, heavy rhythm beats like a rock and roll song, he would remember in 1965. That music didn't hurt anybody, and it sure made you feel good. Sitting in the audience, he sang right along with everyone on stage, trying to hit all the high and low notes. Regis scrunched down in her seat. I would look at him like he was crazy, but that didn't stop him from going right on singing. Regis didn't know it, but he afforded their dates by working the auditorium's concessions, particularly on Monday nights when the hall staged professional wrestling. Guy Coffey, the concessions manager, hired him and other Hume students to sell Cokes, and on a good night Elvis earned $3 or $4. He loved the magic of the place, and he fantasized playing there one day, standing on the same stage as all the greats. Sometimes after the night's event had ended and the Humes kids had settled up financially, Coffey remembered, Elvis would go up on the stage and play to imaginary crowds, bowing to their applause. I would have to tell him, "Come on now, Elvis, we have to close the place up." And he would say, "Yes, sir," and we would walk silently out of the building. Regis enjoyed the gospel songs, for which Elvis always got dressed up in his good clothes, as if he were going to church. But Elvis never invited her to services anywhere, perhaps because he only sporadically attended, and his parents had never become members anywhere once they moved to Memphis. He also knew that there was significant prejudice against the Assembly of God Church. In fact, Regis's own family referred to Pentecostal groups as holy rollers, and as she remembers, I got the impression that the Presleys were religious, but I would have to say that he didn't talk about the Assembly of God because it was snickered about. It was something he wouldn't have told many people. If Elvis felt like an alien among other teenagers most of the time, he was never so out of place than on the night of his senior prom at the swanky and segregated Peabody Hotel in downtown Memphis. Now, at the end of the school year and 4 months into his courtship of Regis, he asked her to be his date. Precisely why he went is a mystery, but he felt some kind of pressure to go and to give the evening a nice flair. "It was the most exciting thing I had ever done," Regis says. "I felt like Cinderella getting ready to go to the royal ball." The 14-year-old hurried to Lerner's to pick out a strapless pink taffeta dress for $14.95, and then, her budget blown, accessorized it with the pink shoes she'd gotten at Easter. Someone suggested she could get her hair done free at the beauty college right across the street from the Peabody, and she quickly made an appointment. She'd never even been in the Peabody before, and as she sat in the beauty chair, looking at the hotel through the window, she said to herself, "Just think, in a few hours from now, I will be back here all dressed up." Elvis was also grooming his hair. His sideburns were now extra long, and choosing his outfit. Regis wondered what he would wear, since he would show up in outfits that were so flashy I would open the door and blink my eyes. But he passed on the idea of a white jacket like the other boys wore, and decided on a conservative dark blue suit and blue suede shoes. He showed up at her door in a shiny rented Chevy, also dark blue, paid for by money he had saved from ushering. Shyly, as Regis blushed, he pinned a pink carnation corsage on her dress. As they entered the Continental Ballroom at the Peabody, the band was playing, and couples were already out on the floor. But Elvis steered Regis to a seat and offered to get her a Coke. Given Billy's rejection and his embarrassment at not knowing how to dance, Elvis would have been enormously uncomfortable at his prom, and tortured at the idea of getting out on the floor in front of his peers. Finally, in case Regis was wondering, he told her. "I can't dance," he said, cracking a self-conscious grin and perspiring under his jacket. Regis took it that he didn't dance because of religion and simply said, "That's all right." And so they sat out the entire night, talking and sipping on soda pop and watching all the other dancers, Elvis's dark blue suit, the color of heartache, further setting them apart. Finally, they lined up with all the other couples for the Grand March, stepping through a mammoth heart as their names were called, and had their picture taken. In it, Regis manages a half smile, but Elvis looks as stiff as a soldier, peering solemnly into the camera. Regis saw it as part of his humor, like the way he curled his lip into a sneer. He made no attempts to socialize, and no one, not Buzzy or George or Red, approached them. But Elvis promised Regis they'd have more fun afterward at Leonard's barbecue, where they were to meet some of his friends and go on to a party. They drove out and waited, but nobody ever showed. Regis could tell it bothered him, and finally, chagrined, Elvis took her home. A few weeks after the prom, Elvis dropped by her house and found the family had simply vanished. Regis's mother, financially strapped, had decided to move in with a relative, and Regis had gone to Florida to help her older sister, who was expecting a baby. I jumped at the chance, because going to Florida and living in a stable home was a lot more inviting than staying in Memphis with this fractured family life. Yet she couldn't bring herself to tell Elvis how bad her situation was. They'd moved so many times, and she was embarrassed. Besides, girls didn't call boys in those days, so she never said goodbye. Like Billy, she just moved off and left. To Elvis, it must have felt as if he'd been spurned 3 times in a row by Betty, Billy, and now Regis. He never learned any different. I've always regretted that. I just figured he'd find out I had left by driving by the house. I've often wondered if he knocked on the door and saw all these strangers, the other people who rented rooms, and wondered who they were. In the move, Regis lost her photo of her prom date. But Elvis kept his, and a few years later, Gladys gave a copy to a fan magazine. By then, Elvis was a teen heartthrob and a national sensation, with very specific dance moves all his own.